What you're about to hear will make you shudder. Imagine police officers weeping in horror at what they've seen. Imagine a family where members die one after another under mysterious circumstances. No, this isn't the plot of a mystical thriller. This is a real story that happened to an incredibly charming girl. Daisy Coleman, a young beauty, seemed to have everything one could dream of: a kind heart, a sharp mind, and numerous talents. However, behind the appearance of this charming girl hid a tormented soul that had to endure terrible events at an early age. Daisy was born in the small town of Albany, Missouri, on March 30th, 1997. Her father, Michael, worked as a doctor, and her mother, Melinda, was a veterinarian. Daisy was raised in the Coleman family along with her 3 biological brothers, being the second child. Tragedy struck the family in 2009 when Michael, Daisy, and one of her younger brothers were traveling to a neighboring town for a wrestling competition. During this trip, their car collided with an obstacle on the road and flew into a ditch. Sadly, as a result of this terrible accident, the head of the family died. After losing her father, the Coleman family moved to the larger city of Maryville, also in Missouri. Melinda single-handedly raised her 3 sons and daughter, and although it wasn't easy, she managed her responsibilities. At that time, no one in the Coleman family, who had already experienced a horrific loss, could even imagine the curse that awaited them in the future. Early in the morning of January 8, 2012, 14-year-old Daisy Coleman regained consciousness in the yard of her own house. Outside, there was a bone-chilling cold, with temperatures reaching 0. Daisy was lying on the snow, her hair frozen to the ground. The girl was wearing only a t-shirt and sweatpants. At that moment, the first thought that flashed through Daisy's mind was, "I must be dead." She couldn't get up or call for help. Her speech was slurred and confused. Daisy was crying. With great difficulty, the girl managed to crawl to the front door of the house and bang on it with all her might. The clock showed 5, and it was a real miracle that Daisy's mother, Melinda, who was sleeping in her room, heard a strange knocking at the door through her sleep. At first, she thought it was their dogs that had gotten cold outside and were trying to get into the house. The woman threw on a robe and headed for the front door to let the animals into the warm home. When Melinda opened the door, she saw her daughter Daisy on the threshold. The girl was lying on the cold steps, almost unconscious. She reeked heavily of alcohol, unable to speak, only crying. The mother instantly screamed, calling for her sons to help. The boys woke up, quickly ran downstairs, and carried the frozen Daisy into the house. The whole family was terrified. At first, they tried to warm the girl with blankets, but the mother, upon closely examining her daughter, realized that her legs were most likely severely frostbitten. So the mother filled the bathtub with water and asked her sons to take Daisy to the bathroom, leave her there, and go out. The girl was still unconscious. The mother herself began to undress her daughter and saw huge bruises and red marks on her legs. It was only at this moment that the woman realized something terrible had happened to her beloved Daisy. The mother gently immersed Daisy in a bathtub with cool water. As a veterinarian, she knew well how to provide first aid for frostbite. The woman gradually increased the water temperature in the bathtub, thus slowly warming her daughter's body. Fortunately, she managed to help Daisy. Soon the girl warmed up, but her speech remained unclear and confused. It was difficult for Daisy to speak, so the alarmed Melinda called 911 and summoned the police. When the police officers arrived at the scene, they immediately began examining Daisy. However, the girl was still under the influence of alcohol, and her mind was clouded, so she couldn't clearly recount the events of the previous night. Under these circumstances, the police had to turn to Daisy's friend, Paige, who was also at the Coleman family's house that night and slept in the same room as Daisy. Paige shared her version of the events with the officers. As her friend recounted, on Saturday, January 7th, 2012, Daisy invited her best friend Paige to her house for a sleepover. In the evening, the girls decided to watch a few horror movies, and, for a greater effect, drank strong alcoholic beverages that they had secretly stolen from the Coleman family's home bar. Closer to midnight, Daisy began exchanging messages with her older brother's friend, 17-year-old Matthew Barnett, who was the star of the school football team. Upon learning that Daisy was spending the night with a friend, Matthew sent the girls a message proposing they have fun at his place.
Daisy and Paige enthusiastically agreed to this adventure and arranged to meet with Matthew and his friends. Around 1 o'clock in the morning on January 8th, the girlfriends snuck out of Daisy's house through her bedroom window and ran around the corner, where Matthew and 4 of his friends were already waiting for them. The boys escorted the girls to Matthew's house, helped them get through the window into the basement, and asked them to be quiet so as not to wake up Barnett's parents, who were sleeping upstairs. According to Paige, as soon as she and Daisy found themselves in the basement, Matthew immediately began treating Daisy to alcohol. Paige sat nearby and watched as her friend drank one glass after another, almost without stopping. At some point, one of the boys, named Nicholas, approached Paige, took her hand, and led her to a neighboring empty room in the basement. There, at the young man's initiative, they had sexual intercourse. Meanwhile, Matthew and Daisy went to another room where there was a large bed. Several times, when the door opened, Paige was able to see what was happening in that room with Daisy. The girl was lying on the bed, barely conscious, unable to speak or move. Matthew took advantage of her helpless state and engaged in sexual intercourse with Daisy. His friend Jordan Zetch filmed everything that was happening on his smartphone camera. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the boys decided it was time to go home. They put the girls in the car and drove them to the Coleman family's house. Paige got out of the car first. Matthew told her that Daisy should sit outside in the fresh air to sober up. The boys assured that they would stay with Daisy and take care of her safety outside. They advised Paige to go home and go to bed. The friend believed their words and agreed to go alone. Paige got to the house, climbed through the window into Daisy's bedroom, fell on the bed, and instantly fell asleep. At this time, the boys pulled Daisy out of the car, set her on her feet, and supported her so she wouldn't fall. The girl got sick, so they took off her shoes, took her purse and cell phone, and held her hair while she vomited. Then they gently laid Daisy on the cold ground near the house. Fearing that they might be noticed and not wanting to take risks, the young men quickly got into the car and drove away. Daisy lay outside for about 3 hours in the bitter cold at 0 temperature. She was wearing only a t-shirt and sweatpants, without socks or shoes. Her hair was wet and frozen. Arriving at the scene on a call, the police officers thoroughly examined the Coleman family's house and the surrounding area. In Daisy's room, they came across 5 empty plastic bottles of alcoholic beverages. In the yard, they found Daisy's bag, her cell phone, shoes, and traces of vomit. That same morning, the victim was taken to the hospital for a medical examination. During the examination, numerous bruises on her legs and tears in the groin area were recorded on Daisy's body. The girl had several tests taken, one of which showed that the alcohol level in her blood was almost twice the maximum allowable limit. After a few hours in the hospital, Daisy finally regained consciousness. She reported that she did not remember any details of the previous night. The girl could not reproduce the details of what happened and admitted that she had drunk too much alcohol. However, Daisy did not deny the fact that she had taken alcoholic beverages from the home bar without her mother's permission and secretly ran away at night to the company of boys. Around 11 a.m. on January 8th, a few hours after the incident, law enforcement officers located Matthew Barnett, Jordan Zetch, and Nicholas Graumaudis. They were charged and all 3 were taken to the police station for interrogation. During questioning, Matthew Barnett did not deny having intimate relations with Daisy Coleman that night. However, he insisted that everything happened by mutual consent. The boy said that when he met Daisy and her friend Paige, the girls were already intoxicated. At first, Matthew denied treating Daisy to alcohol, but the more he spoke, the more entangled he became in his own testimony. Eventually, he did confess to treating Daisy to a few shots of strong drinks to melt her icy heart. Matthew reported that during intercourse, he used a condom, which he threw away on the way back to Daisy's house. Another person involved in the case, Jordan Zetch, initially refused to testify but later admitted to using his friend Nicholas' smartphone to record a video of Matthew kissing Daisy. The video lasted about 10 seconds. Jordan managed to show this video to his friends, but then, getting scared, deleted it. Nicholas, who had sexual intercourse with Daisy's friend Paige, was the only one who immediately fully admitted his guilt. He was sent to a juvenile detention center. Matthew's friend, who drove the boys and girls in his car to Daisy's house, said that throughout the ride, Daisy wouldn't stop crying, and Matthew expressed fears that the girl's brother Charlie would kill him if he found out what happened. At the same time, it became known that a few days before the terrible incident, Matthew had already visited the Coleman's home. That time, he had a peaceful dinner with the family at the same table in a friendly atmosphere. At 1 p.m. on January 8th, a search was conducted in the basement of Matthew Barnett's house. Police officers seized bed linen, several empty bottles, men's underwear, and plastic cups. During repeated interrogations, the sheriff's assistant, while talking to Matthew, was moved by the young man's story. At one point, the officer even suggested that girls often resort to such actions to attract attention. and it is quite possible that this case is one of those. The sheriff's assistant praised Matthew for taking care of the girl and driving her home. However, for some reason, the fact that the boy left Daisy alone to freeze on the street did not attract the officer's proper attention. Several days passed, and Daisy Coleman's health condition completely normalized. Her life was no longer in danger. However, the girl still could not recall any new details of that terrible night. 2 months later, in March 2012, all charges against Matthew Barnett and Jordan Zetch were completely dropped. The district attorney concluded that the intimate relationship between the young people occurred by mutual consent. The video recording that Jordan made that night could not be restored after deletion, although several of Jordan's classmates claimed they saw footage of Matthew kissing Daisy. During the analysis of the couple's smartphones, the investigation found out that Matthew and Daisy maintained telephone communication about once a month. In text messages, Daisy hinted to Matthew that she was ready to have sexual intercourse with him in exchange for a bottle of strong alcohol. In addition, correspondence was found dating back to before January 8th, in which Daisy and Matthew exchanged explicit messages of a sexual nature. After Matthew's release from custody, it became known that he was the grandson of an influential political figure, Rex Barnett, who had previously been a member of the state legislative assembly. Rex Barnett was a member of the Committee on Criminal Law and Public Safety. He had close ties with many prosecutors and police officers throughout the state of Missouri. Matthew and Jordan were released, and the boys returned to their normal lives. At the same time, Daisy Coleman hoped that the hype surrounding her nightly adventure would finally subside. The girl continued her education, but instead of support from her peers, she faced open hostility and ridicule. Most of her acquaintances sided with Matthew, and Daisy began to be called a liar and a slut. She instantly turned into an outcast, withdrew into herself, and tried to spend as much time as possible at home alone. Daisy, who had previously led an active social and public life, was involved in sports and dancing, now simply disappeared from sight. Moreover, the girl was forced to leave the school cheerleading squad. Daisy's mother, Melinda, began receiving anonymous threats daily, both at home and at work. Soon, the woman was asked to quit her job at the veterinary clinic, where she had worked for many years. After that, the Coleman family realized that they could no longer stay in the town of Maryville and decided to move to another place. In the spring of 2013, their empty house in Maryville, put up for sale, burned to the ground. The police never managed to establish the cause of the fire. There were rumors that Matthew Barnett's father was involved. Some time later, under extremely mysterious circumstances, the house of Daisy's friend named Paige also burned down. By that time, the girls had already stopped communicating. By the way, Paige also became an outcast at school. It is known that the girl suffered from nightmares for a long time. As time passed, Daisy's story attracted the attention of the media. The girl began receiving active support from people across the country, especially those who had experienced similar traumatic experiences. Thanks to this, Daisy managed to reopen the case against her main offender, Matthew Barnett. The case went to trial, but the boy was found guilty only of leaving Daisy alone in the cold in the middle of the night. Matthew Barnett was sentenced to 2 years of probation and ordered to pay the Coleman family $2,800 in compensation. The other defendants in the case avoided any charges. Daisy Coleman continued to live her life, but regularly encountered not only words of support, but also threats from anonymous users on the internet. She understood how unfairly people behaved. Daisy took every negative message addressed to her very painfully. In 2016, when 19-year-old Daisy was studying in college, a documentary film titled Audrey and Daisy was released on the Netflix streaming service. The film told the story of violence, bullying, harassment on social networks, and the detrimental consequences this can lead to in the future. Daisy became one of the main characters of the film and shared her story. However, the fate of the second heroine, Audrey Pott from California, turned out to be even more tragic. Almost the same thing happened to Audrey as to Daisy Coleman in 2012. But unlike Daisy, Audrey was unable to cope morally with what happened. The girl's photos quickly spread across the network. Both Audrey's friends and enemies saw them. The last post she left on her social media page contained the following words: "My life is ruined. The whole school knows. I will never get rid of this reputation. Everyone knows how bad I am. I want it all to end." 9 days later, Audrey took her own life. She could not withstand the humiliation that fell upon her from all sides. Audrey's parents were able to initiate a criminal case only 6 months after their daughter's death. The perpetrators, 3 boys, were sentenced to terms ranging from 30 to 45 days. Later, their families paid Audrey's parents about $1 million in moral compensation. Let's return to Daisy Coleman. In 2018, seeking to start life with a clean slate, the girl moved to the state of Colorado, where she got a job at a tattoo parlor. At the same time, she worked on creating a second film project, which focused on the process of her own recovery. However, in June 2018, Daisy faced another shock. Her mother Melinda and brother Tristan got into a car accident while driving to Daisy from their hometown. As a result of the accident, 19-year-old Tristan died. The circumstances of this tragedy remain unknown to this day. After losing her brother, Daisy published a post on social media in which she admitted that every day it became more and more difficult for her to keep her inner demons under control, to put on a smile, and to pretend that everything was fine. After Tristan's death, Daisy co-founded a charitable organization that supported victims of violence. She continued to share her personal tragedy and provide support to other people who found themselves in similar situations. In her publications, Daisy repeatedly talked about how sometimes it was difficult for her to cope with the thoughts swirling in her head. She struggled with emotional pain, panic attacks, and constant terrible memories. In the summer of 2020, 23-year-old Daisy Coleman began sharing disturbing details with her friends. She was being stalked by an unknown man who constantly sent her threats. The girl went to the police and filed a statement that a stranger had been following her since December 2019. Daisy desperately pleaded for help, but her pleas went unanswered. On Tuesday, August 4th, 2020, she published a tweet in which she admitted that she was afraid to leave the house. Daisy wrote that she couldn't even walk her dog or go to work because of the overwhelming fear. She also reported that she had lost her appetite and couldn't sleep. A few hours later, a new post from Daisy appeared on Facebook. She said that some man had approached her house and knocked on the door. The girl confessed that she was very scared. She suggested that this man might have previously stolen her keys, and now it would not be difficult for him to get into her home. In addition, Daisy reported that the unknown man had stolen her photos and registered on one of the sites, where he offered intimate services for money on her behalf. Melinda, Daisy's mother, upon stumbling upon her daughter's message on social media, immediately called the Colorado police asking them to check on the girl. At 4 p.m., officers arrived at Daisy's home. She let them into the house, and the police spent about an hour with her. The girl again told them about being stalked by an unknown man. The officers did not notice anything suspicious in Daisy's behavior. But shortly after the law enforcement officers left, 23-year-old Daisy Coleman contacted her boyfriend via video call. During the conversation, she suddenly took out a gun, pointed it at herself, and pulled the trigger. Her boyfriend did not immediately realize what had happened. The connection was cut off. Daisy stopped answering calls. Frightened, the young man dialed 911. When the police officers arrived at Daisy Coleman's house again at 8 p.m., they found the girl already dead. One of the police officers couldn't hold back and burst into tears at the sight. The girl had a fatal gunshot wound. She was lying in a pool of blood. Melinda, Daisy's mother, reported her daughter's death in a post on her social media page. She wrote, "Daisy was my best friend and a wonderful daughter. How I wish I could take her pain away. She never recovered from what those boys did to her back in school. It's just not fair. My girl is gone from us." The woman said that she had fought for Daisy and her mental health for many years. She believed that she had done everything possible for her beloved daughter. The mother also confirmed that in recent months, Daisy was indeed being stalked, and just recently, the girl found out that she would never be able to have children. After Daisy's death, the tattoo parlor where she worked was robbed. The perpetrator stole an album with Daisy's exclusive sketches and her tattoo machine. 4 months passed. In December 2020, 58-year-old Melinda Coleman published another heartfelt post on social media dedicated to her beloved daughter. And soon after, the woman took a gun in her hands and did the same as Daisy. Only 2 sons remained in the Coleman family, the older Charlie and the younger Logan. The charitable organization founded by Daisy organized a fundraiser to support the boys. It became known that Matthew Barnett's life and career were going well. After the death of Daisy and her mother Melinda, he expressed words of sympathy about the tragedy that befell the Coleman family. "I hope that Daisy's story will be the impetus for change in our society. We must create a world in which no child will suffer from violence, where every voice will be heard, and every victim will receive support and justice. Thank you for being with me and listening to this difficult story. I love each and every one of you. May the memory of Daisy Coleman forever remain in our hearts as a reminder that love, compassion, and support are what make us human. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones. The case of Tracy Grissom is one of the most high-profile cases in the US in the 2010s, once again drawing public attention to the issue of domestic violence. The morning of May 15, 2012 forever changed the lives of two families from the town of Tuscaloosa in Alabama. 32-year-old Tracy Grissom took a gun, got behind the wheel of her Chevrolet, and set off in search of her ex-husband Ron. Less than an hour later, Ron was dead, and Tracy had cold-bloodedly called 911 herself and reported the events. Their marriage lasted 8 years and was full of suffering and cruelty. Ron repeatedly beat, raped, and humiliated Tracy. After the divorce, the woman hoped to start a new life, but according to her, Ron continued to stalk and threaten her. Tracy claimed that she killed her ex-husband in defense of her own life. The prosecution, however, accused her of premeditated, planned murder. This ambiguous case split the local community. Some sympathized with Tracy as a victim of years of abuse, while others condemned her as a cold-blooded killer. The trial was a test not only for Tracy, but also for the justice system. Will the jury be able to see beyond one crime the story of exhausting abuse? And most importantly, where exactly is the truth? Now I will tell you everything in detail. My name is Detective Brooks, and you're on the DBS channel. Let's get to the bottom of the truth. Ron Grissom grew up in a family with strong traditions in the small town of Tuscaloosa, Alabama. The boy was born and raised in a strong, traditional family where an atmosphere of love and support prevailed. His father Ronnie and mother Rose were happy with their sons and proud of their successes. During his school years, Ron was the star of the local baseball team. Everyone remembers him as a cheerful, sociable young man, the life of the party. It seems that this was when he first tried alcohol and marijuana, the usual mischief for boys of that age. However, these seemingly innocent experiments laid the foundation for an addiction that would later ruin his life. After school, Ron, as befits, went to work with his father in the family construction business. It was a good, stable job with prospects for growth in the future. But it seems the guy lacked the drive and thrill. He still liked to relax with friends, drink a couple of beers, and smoke various psychotropic substances. In 2003, fate brought Ron together with Tracy, a blonde a couple of years older than him. She already had an unsuccessful marriage behind her and a young son. But Ron seemed to really fall in love. Despite the warnings of relatives, he married Tracy a year later. At first, everything was going well, but soon problems returned. Substance abuse does not go unnoticed, believe me. Soon quarrels began in the young family, and when their long-awaited daughter Anna was finally born in 2006, after several miscarriages, the situation worsened. The girl was born prematurely with heart defects. The burden of caring for her fell on Tracy's shoulders, while Ron increasingly withdrew from affairs. Instead of being with his wife and children, he increasingly hung out with friends and had affairs on the side. Of course, this infuriated Tracy. She was jealous and made scenes. According to her, that's when Ron first raised his hand to her, although he later denied the beatings. In 2010, Tracy couldn't take it anymore and filed for divorce. It would seem that now Ron had a chance to start all over again, to become a better father to Anna. But no, the ex-wife claims that he still broke into her house, threatened and abused her. Even after the official dissolution of the marriage in 2011, Ron allegedly did not leave Tracy alone. Of course, the man denied all accusations. He said that these were Tracy's fabrications, a way to take revenge on him. He returned to live with his parents, worked in their firm, and tried to get his life back on track. Now let's get to know the other key figure in this tragic story better, Tracy Grissom. The woman was born on November 24, 1976 in the small town of Northport, Alabama. She was the only child of Mike Hennigan, a Vietnam War veteran, and his wife Diane. I suppose her father saw in his daughter the embodiment of his unfulfilled dreams and had high hopes for her future. Tracy grew up to be an active, purposeful girl. She did well in school, played sports, and dreamed of someday mastering the noble profession of a nurse. Everything was going well, and it seemed that a worthy career and a quiet life awaited her. After graduating from school, Tracy entered the local college for nursing courses. There she met her first husband and quickly married for great love. But family idyll did not last long. In 2001, when their little son James was born, the relationship had already cracked. A couple of years later, the marriage finally fell apart, and Tracy was left alone with a child in her arms. Perhaps it was then that despair settled in the heart of the young woman. After all, she so longed to find a reliable male shoulder, a loving father for her boy. And then, as luck would have it, fate gives her a second chance, a meeting with Ron Grissom at a party in 2003. Ron was younger than Tracy, but his sincere care for little James melted her heart. A year later, they were married. But dreams of a cozy family crashed again against the harsh reality. Shortly after the wedding, it turned out that Ron had problems with illicit substances. Tracy did not tolerate this, and conflicts began. The birth of their long-awaited daughter Anna in 26 brought the couple together for a while. But the girl was born prematurely, with poor health. The burden of caring for her fell on Tracy. The husband not only did not help, he increasingly plunged into bad habits and behaved aggressively. According to Tracy, from 29, Ron constantly humiliated her, raised his hand to her. It happened that during quarrels, the woman suffered such beatings that she had to make up stories to colleagues about accidental falls down the stairs. I can imagine how unbearable it was for her to hide the bruises under a layer of foundation and pretend that everything was fine. In 2010, Tracy's patience snapped and she filed for divorce. Unfortunately, even after the breakup, the nightmare did not end. From then on, according to Tracy, her life turned into sheer hell. She was afraid to leave the house, suffered from constant anxiety and nightmares. She turned to the police for help, but to no avail. She had to rely only on herself. So the woman bought a gun so, in her opinion, she could protect herself and her children from her furious ex-husband. So, Tracy and Ron's marriage, which lasted 8 long years, was more like hell than a union of 2 loving hearts. Tracy's story paints a horrifying picture. For years, her husband subjected her to inhuman abuse. Beatings, forced sex, death threats. It seems that Ron did not disdain any way to humiliate and intimidate his wife. It was especially scary when he was pumped up with various psychotropic substances or alcohol. At first, Tracy tried to fight. She called the police twice, ran to relatives, but each time, under pressure from Ron, she withdrew her statements. And in return, she received even more brutal punishments from her sadistic husband. Eventually, the woman found herself in a vicious circle of fear from which she saw no way out. She lived as if on a powder keg, expecting a new outbreak of violence at any moment. The last straw, according to Tracy, was a horrific incident in November 2010. Ron broke into her house in the middle of the night, beat her, raped her, and left her unconscious on the bathroom floor. This time, Tracy firmly decided enough is enough. The next day, she went to the hospital and documented all the wounds and bruises. And then she filed an official report with the police, hoping that the abuser would be brought to justice. But the wheels of justice turned slowly. Ron was detained but released on bail. He was forbidden to approach Tracy, but how can that stop an enraged abuser? He violated the ban again and again, came demanding to see his daughter. And it is noteworthy that Ron's parents and friends did not believe in his guilt and supported him in every possible way. Black days began for Tracy. She almost never left the house, afraid of meeting Ron. She armed herself with a gun for self-defense. But there was no peace, day or night. The woman was tormented by nightmares where she again and again found herself in the hands of a rapist. Because of these experiences, she lost a lot of weight and turned grey. Of course, Tracy cherished the hope that Ron would be put behind bars and she would finally be able to start life anew. But the bureaucratic machine stalled. Court hearings were constantly postponed. Ron was at large and did not miss an opportunity to terrorize his victim. In early May 2012, he showed up at her house again with threats. Tracy called the cops, but the scoundrel fled before they arrived. Can you imagine the state of this tormented woman? She did not sleep all night, trembling with fear for her life. And when she found out that Ron had even got a job, although he had previously pretended to be unemployed in order not to pay alimony, her despair reached its limit. The morning of May 15, 2012 turned out to be remarkably clear and warm, but not for Tracy Grissom. Then the 32-year-old woman woke up with a heavy heart and obsessive thoughts about her ex-husband Ron. She was going to a job interview for a nursing position, but she couldn't concentrate at all, because she had just found out Ron, who swore up and down in court that he was unemployed, was actually working again, and this infuriated her to no end. Tracy decided to expose her ex-husband's lies at all costs. She got behind the wheel and headed to the place where Ron usually worked, the construction side of the firm Grissom and Grissom. The plan was simple, to take a few photos of Ron at his workplace and then present them in court as proof of his deception. Approaching the construction site, Tracy saw the company's billboard from afar, and the next moment her heart sank. There was Ron himself. Together with his cousin Dale Dockery, he was just unloading some boat. Tracy parked the car nearby, took out the gun with trembling hands, and headed towards her ex. And here the discrepancies begin. According to Tracy, as soon as Ron noticed her, he immediately rushed in her direction with curses and a threatening look on his face. The woman panicked, pulled out a weapon, and shouted for him not to approach. But he allegedly did not even think to stop. That's when she fired, supposedly defending herself. However, the Dockery brothers tell a completely different version. They say that when Tracy drove up and Ron saw her, he immediately shouted to Dale to call the police, and he himself rushed to flee, trying to hide. But Tracy started shooting after him. Be that as it may, as many as 6 shots were fired. 4 bullets found their target. 1 hit Ron in the shoulder, 1 in the forearm, 2 in the back. The heavily wounded man collapsed to the ground and tried to crawl away. But Tracy came up almost point blank and cold-bloodedly finished him off with 2 shots to the head. Later, the examination will confirm it was these control shots that proved fatal for Ron. After the deed, Tracy returned to the car, put the gun on the hood, and called the police. She told the dispatcher that she had just shot her ex-husband, who had been abusing her for years. She seemed to be asking for help and at the same time confessing to murder. The local police from Tuscaloosa arrived at the crime scene very quickly. Tracy Grissom, surprisingly, did not resist arrest at all. She immediately confessed to the deed, explaining her actions by years of violence from the late Ron. Now her fate was in the hands of the investigators. The detectives thoroughly documented the crime scene, interviewed all possible witnesses, and seized physical evidence, primarily the gun with Tracy's fingerprints. Ron's cousin, who saw the shooting with their own eyes, immediately gave their testimony. According to them, it turned out that Tracy purposefully came to Ron's place of work, called him out to talk, and then started shooting. Moreover, as Dale Dockery claimed, Ron did not show any aggression towards his ex-wife and only tried to escape and hide. The body of the deceased was sent for autopsy, and the conclusions of the forensic experts were unfavorable for Tracy. The bullets that hit Ron in the back when he was already lying on the ground, defeated, turned out to be fatal. These facts clearly did not fit with Tracy's version of self-defense. Rather, they indicated that she had arrived at the meeting with a clear intention to kill her ex-spouse. However, during interrogations, Tracy remained surprisingly calm and consistent. Slowly, in detail, she retold the investigators about the years of suffering she had to endure with Ron. She recalled constant beatings, humiliation, rape. She emphasized that her ex-husband terrorized her even after the divorce, not allowing her to live a normal life. However, the investigation also had other testimonies. Ron's relatives and friends unanimously claimed that recently he had avoided any contact with Tracy, that it was she who constantly pursued him, called him, came to his home and work, made jealous scenes and provoked quarrels. They say that Ron was desperately trying to start life from scratch, and then such a tragedy. Moreover, the detectives did not find any evidence of Ron's visit to Tracy's home on the eve of the murder, which she spoke about. The neighbors interviewed heard and saw nothing of the kind. The surveillance camera recordings also did not record anything suspicious. On the other hand, the ex-wife found several witnesses ready to confirm her words. In particular, her friend Lauren Richards said that Tracy had come to her more than once during that period, hiding from Ron, and Lauren saw with her own eyes numerous bruises and wounds on her friend's body. But as it turned out, all these testimonies concerned events that had happened several years ago. The investigators did not find any evidence that Ron had abused Tracy during the last months before the murder. Instead, their attention was drawn to one strange fact. It turns out that Tracy had a valid life insurance policy on her ex-husband and regularly paid the premiums. Although usually divorced couples terminate such policies. But the most interesting thing is different. The day before the murder, the woman called the insurance company. She admitted that now she really needed money, and she clarified the details of the insurance coverage. Having weighed all the collected facts and testimonies, the prosecutor's office of the district qualified Tracy Grissom's actions as premeditated murder in the first degree. The woman, who allegedly only sought to protect herself from a domestic tyrant, now faced a serious term up to life imprisonment, and only the decision of the jury would determine whether her reprisal against Ron was justified. My God, what drove her to such a desperate act? And was self-defense really the only motive? What other secrets does this horrific story of family hell hide? The case was heard in the Circuit Court of Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and attracted considerable attention from the public and the press. No wonder. After all, the defendant's bench was occupied by a victim of domestic violence who took justice into her own hands. In August 2014, after 2 years of investigation, Tracy finally appeared in court. The small courtroom could barely accommodate all those who wanted to see the defendant with their own eyes. There were relatives of the deceased Ron, friends of Tracy, and just concerned townspeople. And where would we be without reporters who were literally hunting for sensational details? And finally, Tracy is brought into the hall. Pale, emaciated, she barely stands on her feet. She sits down next to her lawyer Warren Freeman, who until the last moment hopes to mitigate the charges. Maybe, instead of intentional murder, it will be possible to prove unintentional, committed in the heat of passion. But where there? The prosecutor is adamant. Tracy Grissom must answer under the most serious article. The defense strategy is based on evidence of years of violence that Tracy had to endure from her late husband. Lawyer Freeman provides the court with medical reports made after Ron brutally beat and raped his wife in 2010. Allegedly, the woman is still suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, and at the time of the murder was in a state of passion. She did not control herself when she shot the abuser. But here the judge makes an unexpected move. He forbids showing the jury photos of the beaten Tracy, taken a few days after the rape. Because, you see, formally these pictures do not prove Ron's guilt, because the case of violence at the time of his death was still pending in court. Such a twist! And the prosecutor, meanwhile, takes the bull by the horns. Instead of digging into the past, he focuses on the events of the day of the murder. Why, he says, did Tracy come to the meeting with Ron armed? Why did she continue to shoot when he was already lying wounded? And most importantly, what got into her the day before to call the insurance company to be interested in payments? The atmosphere in the courtroom is oppressive, electrified. Ron's relatives are openly calling Tracy a cunning murderer who lured her ex into a trap for money. Tracy's loved ones are sobbing as she describes in detail the suffering and fear for her life that she endured. But the biggest blow is yet to come. When asked by the prosecutor if Tracy regrets what she did, she utters a phrase that takes the jury's breath away. "No, if I could turn back time, I would do it again. I only regret not shooting him earlier." After such words, even the most sympathetic jurors begin to doubt. Was she really acting in self-defense? The finale of the trial is expected and no less dramatic. After several hours of debate, the jury finds Tracy Grissom guilty of first-degree murder. No matter what the lawyer said about domestic violence, the reprisal against a defenseless man went too far. The judge gives the defendant the last word, but she only silently shakes her head, eyes downcast. She is given 25 years in prison. Friends, looking through the materials of this case, I couldn't get rid of the thought. If only Ron's abuser had been convicted of domestic violence at the time, would it have come to such a bloody denouement? If the state had provided Tracy with reliable protection, helped to break the toxic connection with the abuser, would she have dared to take the law into her own hands? You see how easily the situation gets out of control when the escalation of violence is not stopped in time, when cries for help are ignored. This tragedy should have been a lesson for all of us. Countering domestic terror is not only a matter for the police or social services. It is a shared responsibility of society, of each and every one of us. Friends, the case of Tracy Grissom is not just another criminal story. It is a wake-up call for our entire society, a kind of litmus test that revealed a whole range of systemic problems, and above all, the problem of domestic violence and the protection of its victims. You see, on the one hand, Tracy's story clearly demonstrated how imperfect our laws are in this area, and how indifferent and helpless law enforcement officers can be. The woman repeatedly turned to the police, begged for help, but she never received reliable protection from her aggressive ex-husband. The system seemed to ignore her suffering, shrugging off her cries for help, and as a result, here you have a bloody denouement. On the other hand, this high-profile case clearly showed even the hell of domestic terror cannot be a justification for lynching. Yes, Tracy suffered terrible, inhuman abuse. Her life turned into a continuous nightmare from which she saw no legal way out. But does this give an indulgence for murder? Especially when the direct threat has already passed, when the offender is not attacking right now. Looking through the case files, I came to a disappointing conclusion. At the moment when the bullets were hitting Ron Grissom, Tracy was not defending her life. She was committing a brutal reprisal, and no matter how painful it is to admit it, the law is not on her side here. The verdict, 25 years behind bars, came like a bolt from the blue for Tracy's relatives and the concerned public. Everyone who had even a little sympathy for this suffering woman was shocked and outraged. Here is her friend Lauren from TV screens cursing the court for callousness and formalism. They say if they had seen all those horrific proofs of torture, their hand would not have risen to condemn the victim so. But unfortunately, from the point of view of law, everything was cast iron. Tracy's case instantly became the main topic of discussion throughout the country. Talk shows, documentaries, newspaper pages, everywhere there was only talk about the fate of this fragile woman. And you know, it's good, because finally they started talking out loud about the hushed-up trouble about domestic violence and the helplessness of its victims. Society, as if by the wave of a magic wand, split into two camps. Some sincerely sympathized with Tracy, called her sentence a social injustice, demanded a review of the case. Others approved of the severity of the judges. They say that nothing, not even years of torture, gives the right to punish and pardon with one's own hand. The law is the law. By the way, Tracy herself did not accept it either. Through her lawyer, she immediately filed an appeal. They say there was pressure on the jury and important evidence was ignored. Unfortunately, as we know, all these attempts were in vain. The higher courts left the verdict unchanged. Probably, deep down, Tracy herself understood there was no way back. All that remained was to accept it and atone for the guilt. From behind the prison walls, she wrote touching letters to her children and parents. She begged forgiveness for the pain she had caused her loved ones. She even gave interviews from behind bars a couple of times. She urged all women who suffer from domestic violence not to remain silent. She said, "Shout at the top of your voice, don't be afraid. Seek protection from the law, not from weapons, because weapons will not lead to anything good." Tracy herself will pay in full for her fatal choice with her freedom. She will see freedom only in 2029, at the age of 53. And she really hopes that at the prison threshold she will be met by her adult children's son James and daughter Anna. Then, perhaps, she herself will promise herself never to repeat the terrible mistakes of the past. Friends, today I want to talk to you about one of the most painful and ambiguous topics in our society. About domestic violence, lynching, and the inexorability of justice. A vivid example of this problem is the case of Tracy Grissom, a woman who is driven to despair by years of abuse by her husband. Can her act really be called self-defense? Where is the line between the victim's right to salvation and the law's obligation to punish the murderer? Let's try to figure it out. A terrifying picture emerges from the case files. Tracy suffered for years from the cruelty of Ron Grissom. Beatings, humiliation, sexual violence, it seems that this man did not disdain anything to break his wife. Even after the divorce, he continued to terrorize her and the children. It is easy to imagine the hell in which this tormented woman lived. At some point, she probably really believed, Ron will not calm down until he kills her or someone close to her. But the law is the law, and it clearly distinguishes between self-defense and lynching. Here I must agree with the conclusions of the investigation. The circumstances of Ron's murder in particular. The control shots into a motionless body do not at all fall under the definition of necessary defense. Tracy clearly crossed the line beyond which fear for one's own life becomes a thirst for reprisal, and no matter how painful it is for us to admit it, according to the letter of the law, she deserved the sentence. Another thing is that this case has become a litmus test for the entire legal system. It exposed glaring gaps in the mechanisms for protecting victims of domestic terror. Well, think for yourself. Tracy repeatedly begged for help, but the police waved their hands every time. They say, "We do not interfere in family quarrels." Left alone with her pain, feeling hopeless, the woman grabbed a weapon. So, don't we have to share responsibility with her for this tragedy? Yes, we are with you. All those who for years watched Ron's bullying and did not intervene. All those who lacked compassion to lend Tracy a shoulder. Finally, all of us who tolerate the silent existence of domestic violence next to us. Is it really necessary to wait for a bloody denouement in order to remedy this trouble? This sad case must awaken our society. We must together create an atmosphere of zero tolerance for violence in the family. Provide victims with reliable protection and support mechanisms. After all, the main conclusion of the Tracy Grissom case is this: no suffering justifies murder. And if we do not want to observe new tragedies, lynching must remain outside of civilization. Courtney Clenny, a young and attractive blonde who craved fame, found herself at the center of a scandal due to the tragic death of her boyfriend, Christian. Despite the girl's and her lawyer's claims of self-defense, the evidence gathered during the investigation points to a deliberate murder committed by Courtney. From the age of 13, Courtney, whose real name is Courtney Clenny, had a clear plan for achieving popularity. After moving with her family to Austin, Texas, she began her journey in show business by participating as an extra in films. The girl dreamed of becoming a Hollywood star and did not miss any opportunity, appearing in commercials for well-known brands such as Pepsi. The pursuit of fame and popularity from a young age can often lead to disastrous consequences, especially when ambition outweighs common sense and moral principles. Courtney understood that her attractiveness and charisma were powerful tools for attracting attention. She actively developed her career, appearing in music videos of popular performers and posing for the men's magazine Playboy. Later, she managed to land a few small roles on television and in movies. Along with her career in the entertainment industry, Courtney became passionate about fitness. Moving to Los Angeles in 2017 was a turning point. Her popularity on Instagram skyrocketed, turning the girl into a millionaire blogger. Subscribers admired her perfect body and dedication to a healthy lifestyle. However, behind the ideal image on social media, there were problems in Courtney's personal life. Her relationship with Christian, which began in 2020, quickly grew from passion into a toxic mix of jealousy, control, and aggression. Despite the luxurious apartment in Miami and the seemingly carefree life, behind the scenes of the relationship, scandals and violence were raging. Courtney Clooney, in her pursuit of popularity, did not miss any opportunity. Starting from 2015, she began appearing in music videos of famous artists. It was an important step in her career, as it allowed her to gradually move from being an extra to more prominent roles in advertisements and music videos. The path to fame is rarely easy and often requires gradual advancement, taking advantage of every opportunity. At the same time, Courtney posed for the men's magazine Playboy, which undoubtedly added to her recognition. Later that year, she managed to land a few small roles on television and in movies, which was another step in her career. However, Courtney did not limit herself to just the entertainment sphere. She also became passionate about fitness and decided to try her hand in this field. In 2017, the girl took a bold step moving to Los Angeles. This decision turned out to be fateful, as her popularity on Instagram skyrocketed, turning Courtney into a millionaire blogger. Subscribers were delighted with the beautiful and athletic girl who regularly shared her workouts and achievements. Courtney herself admitted that she was inspired by the example of another fitness model and decided to follow in her footsteps, participating in various fitness competitions. At these events, Courtney's body looked flawless, evoking admiration from the audience. Courtney's popularity on social media continued to grow rapidly, but it was not enough for the girl. She craved even greater fame and scale. It seemed that Courtney was ready to do anything to achieve her goal, and nothing could stand in the way of her ambitions. Unrestrained thirst for fame can cloud the mind and force a person to cross the line of what is allowed. It is important to stop in time and think about the price that will have to be paid for one's aspirations. In her pursuit of even greater popularity and financial success, Courtney Clooney decided to take a bold step, create an account on the OnlyFans platform. This social network allows users to create closed communities where subscribers get access to exclusive content for a monthly fee. Most often, the most popular content on OnlyFans is adult material. Platforms like OnlyFans can become a tempting way for young and ambitious people to get rich quick. However, it is important to understand the potential risks and consequences associated with producing and distributing adult content. Courtney created her OnlyFans profile under the pseudonym Courtney Clooney, maintaining some anonymity. In her profile description, she stated that she works as a full-time fitness model and has two beloved dogs, Jessie and Ranger. The girl was fully aware of her attractiveness and charisma, which would help her attract and retain the attention of subscribers. According to some reports, Courtney managed to earn over $3 million thanks to OnlyFans alone. This impressive amount testifies to her popularity and the willingness of fans to pay for access to her content. Financial success on platforms like OnlyFans can create the illusion of easy money and endless opportunities. In March 2022, shortly before committing a terrible crime, Courtney became a guest on the comedy podcast We're Not Miami. During the interview, she jokingly called herself a crazy toxic girlfriend. Although it sounded like a joke, there is often a grain of truth in such statements. This statement by Courtney may indicate her awareness of her own problematic character traits and unhealthy patterns of behavior in relationships. Perhaps she considered her toxicity and craziness as something attractive or even funny.
not realizing the real consequences of such an attitude. Self-irony and jokes about one's own shortcomings can be a way to hide real problems and avoid responsibility for one's actions. It is important to take alarming signals in a person's behavior seriously, even if they are presented in the form of jokes. The We're Not Miami podcast became a kind of harbinger of the tragic events unfolding in Courtney Clooney's life. Her joke about craziness and toxicity turned out to be a chilling prediction of the future, which, unfortunately, became a reality. During her appearance on the podcast, Courtney Clooney was quite frank about her preferences in men. Without any hesitation, she stated that she prefers to date exclusively wealthy black guys. Moreover, Courtney emphasized her dislike for any control or instructions from a partner, which indicates her independent and strong-willed character. Such candid statements about racial and financial preferences when choosing a partner may indicate a superficial attitude towards relationships and a potential tendency towards mercantilism. The victim in this tragic story was Christian, also known as Toby Obums. Like Courtney, he was originally from Texas, but relatively little information is available about him. From the available data on social networks, it is known that Christian studied communications at Texas Tech University and was engaged in trading. Courtney and Christian met and started dating around 2020. Initially, they lived together in a hotel, but later moved to a luxurious apartment in a 53-story building in Miami. Their residence was located on the 23rd floor with a stunning view of the waterfront. The couple enjoyed all the advantages of a wealthy life, including a private elevator that took them directly to the door of their apartment. Despite Courtney's active presence on social media and her growing popularity, Christian was much more restrained in his online activities. He rarely appeared in public, and even in videos with Courtney, his presence was minimal. This may indicate his unwillingness to be in the spotlight or a certain discomfort with the publicity of their relationship. It seems quite strange that despite living together in a luxurious apartment in Miami, Courtney and Christian never flaunted their relationship on social media. Perhaps it was a conscious decision of the couple or evidence of certain problems in their relationship that they tried to hide from prying eyes. The discrepancy between the public image and the real state of affairs in a relationship is often an alarming signal. If people excessively hide their personal life or avoid demonstrating their relationship, it may indicate the presence of serious problems or even abusive patterns of behavior. The luxurious apartment where Courtney Clooney and Christian Obums lived was registered exclusively in the girl's name. According to available information, the monthly rent for this residence reached an impressive $10,000. At first glance, the couple enjoyed an ideal life of luxury and prosperity. However, behind the closed doors of their relationship, serious problems were hidden, invisible to the outside eye. An alarming signal about the unhealthy state of Courtney and Christian's relationship was the information about numerous police calls to their apartment. In the period from January 2022, when the couple moved into the apartment, until the moment of the tragedy, law enforcement officers were called at least 7 times. It is striking that all these incidents occurred within just 4 months of living together. On April 6, 2022, the world was shaken by the news of a brutal murder in this luxurious skyscraper. The media reported a fatally wounded man, but the name of the suspect in the crime had not yet been revealed. The police discovered the body of a 27-year-old victim with a fatal stab wound. Later, friends recognized the deceased as Christian Obums and provided law enforcement with information that he lived in this building with his girlfriend, Courtney Clooney. The tragic death of a young person is always a great loss and shock for loved ones. It is especially chilling to realize that the murder took place in a place that was supposed to be a safe haven, one's own home. Initially, friends characterized Christian as a smart and energetic guy. However, as new details about his relationship with Courtney emerged, it became clear that behind the external gloss, there were serious problems. It turned out that the couple had experienced instances of both physical and moral abuse from both sides. In particular, one of the neighbors claimed to have witnessed Christian raising his hand against Courtney. At the same time, the couple's friends spoke of instances when they saw Courtney hit Christian. Domestic violence is a serious problem that, unfortunately, is often hushed up and ignored. Victims often feel ashamed or afraid to talk about their experiences, especially when the aggressor is their partner. It is important to remember that violence can never be justified, and everyone deserves a healthy and safe relationship. These testimonies paint a chilling picture of a toxic and abusive relationship that led to a tragic denouement. Despite the outward glitz and glamour, behind the doors of Courtney and Christian's apartment, a real drama unfolded,
full of pain, suffering, and violence. Despite the perfect picture that Courtney Clooney and Christian Obunz displayed on social media, the reality of their relationship was far from a fairy tale. It is enough to look behind the scenes of the glossy photos to discover the chilling truth, a toxic relationship full of violence and manipulation. One should not blindly trust the ideal images that people present online, because reality can be much darker and more painful. When information about Christian's potential killer became public, Courtney wasted no time and immediately hired a lawyer named Frank Prieto. The defense attorney immediately stated that the girl acted exclusively in self-defense and was herself a victim of domestic violence by Christian. Prieto claimed that on the day of the tragedy, Christian broke into the apartment without Courtney's permission, since the residence was registered only in her name, and the couple was allegedly separated and not living together at that time. The lawyer insisted that Christian's only purpose when he illegally burst into the apartment was to commit violent acts against Courtney. According to the defense attorney, the former partners had broken up a month before the horrible incident. Courtney's mother said that her daughter was afraid to even leave the house, as her ex-boyfriend was constantly trying to break down the door, and when he failed to do so, he slept right on the stairwell, waiting for an opportunity to get inside. Obsession and stalking by former partners is a serious problem that can escalate into tragedy. Victims often feel helpless and frightened, not knowing how to protect themselves from the aggressor. A few days before the tragic incident, the police were called to Courtney and Christian's apartment. Law enforcement officers noticed bruises on the girl's arms and legs, which could indicate the use of physical force. According to the defense version, Courtney stabbed Christian only after he knocked her to the floor and tried to grab her by the throat. This situation allegedly forced the girl to resort to radical measures to save her own life. However, despite all the lawyer's arguments, many questions and doubts remained about the veracity of this version of events. Was Courtney really a victim defending herself from an attacker? Or was there something more sinister and premeditated behind it? Write your opinion in the comments. Christian Obunz's family was shocked and outraged by the statements of Courtney Clooney's lawyer about self-defense. They categorically refused to believe that the knife wound that led to the death of their son and brother was justified and necessary for protection. Loved ones described Christian as a caring, kind, and athletic guy who could not pose a threat to his girlfriend. As it became known, the murder occurred on April 3, 3 days before the media picked up this news and it gained publicity. According to the autopsy results, Christian received a penetrating stab wound to the chest, which caused him fatal injuries. The blade entered the body to a depth of 7.5 centimeters, which indicates the force and intent of the blow. However, Courtney Clooney's behavior after the incident raised even more questions and outrage from the public. On October 8, just 5 days after she killed her boyfriend, the girl was spotted in a bar in Miami with her father. It seemed that she felt quite well and did not show any signs of stress or worries about what had happened. Such brazen and carefree behavior of a murder suspect is shocking and outrageous. It is hard to believe that a person who has just taken the life of their partner can return to their usual way of life so quickly, as if nothing had happened. This may indicate a lack of remorse, empathy, and awareness of the consequences of one's actions. One of the bar patrons who knew about the murder situation filmed a viral video in which he tried to shame and expel Courtney from the establishment. In the recording, you can hear the woman being indignant at the fact that the suspect in the murder came to drink and have fun as if everything was fine. This video quickly gained popularity on the web, and in the comments, people expressed the same feelings of anger and indignation at Courtney's act. Viewers could not understand how a girl who had cold-bloodedly killed her boyfriend just a few days ago could be so mentally balanced and carefree. Her behavior defied common sense and raised many questions about her true role and motives in this terrible crime. One of the most outrageous aspects of this case for the public was that Courtney Clooney was not arrested immediately after the incident. Instead of ending up behind bars, the girl continued to live her usual life as if nothing had happened. In June 2022, she returned to her hometown of Austin to be closer to her parents. There, Courtney bought a luxurious house worth almost $1.5 million and transferred the same amount to her father's account. People could not understand how a girl who had just taken another person's life could continue her existence so carelessly, as if nothing had happened. It seemed that Courtney did not expect any consequences for what she had done and felt absolutely unpunished. Another detail that constantly attracted public attention was the racial aspect of this case. A beautiful white girl killed her black boyfriend and did not face punishment for it. In society, and especially among Christians' relatives and friends, there was a growing sense of injustice and the existence of certain privileges for an attractive white woman. Racial inequality and bias in the justice system is a painful and long-standing problem in our society. When a criminal avoids punishment because of their skin color, status, or appearance, it undermines trust in the law and generates feelings of helplessness and anger among the victims and their loved ones. An interesting fact was that Courtney's father, as it turned out, was unaware of his daughter's account on the OnlyFans website. This is a platform where users can share explicit content with their subscribers for money. Considering that Courtney had huge wealth and could afford to buy a house for $1.5 million, the question arises, how did her father explain to himself the origin of this money? This detail adds even more confusion and suspicion to an already convoluted and chilling story. Did Courtney's father know about her real life and sources of income? Or was he perhaps part of some scheme himself or covering up his daughter's illegal activities? The long-awaited arrest of Courtney Cleaney took place on August 10, 2022 in Hawaii, where she was staying in a rehabilitation center. The reason for her stay in the facility was substance abuse and post-traumatic stress disorder. After being detained, Courtney was taken to Florida, where the next day, August 11, she was officially arrested on charges of second-degree murder. Now let's consider the official version of the events of that fatal day and the timeline, according to the prosecution. On Sunday, April 3, 2022, Christian Obams left the apartment he shared with Courtney in Miami around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Later, at 4:23 p.m., he returned home with sandwiches for himself and his girlfriend. An interesting fact is that shortly before Christian's return, namely at 4:01 p.m., Courtney was live streaming on Instagram for her followers. In the video, she was wearing the same clothes that the police later photographed her in after the incident. This detail caught the attention of many people working on the case, as Courtney's behavior seemed strange and inadequate. The fact that the suspect was acting so carefree and relaxed shortly before the tragedy raises many questions. Could she have been planning something terrible while being live, or was it perhaps an attempt to create an alibi? Or maybe her strange behavior was the result of using some substances that affected her consciousness and actions. Many people had the feeling that Courtney was under the influence of psychoactive substances during the live stream. Her manner of communication, gestures, and facial expressions seemed unnatural and strange. This observation only heightened suspicions about her possible involvement in the subsequent tragic events. The question remains open. Was this live stream a spontaneous decision by Courtney, or perhaps part of some sinister plan? Was she trying to deflect suspicion from herself in this way, or create an impression of normality before committing a terrible crime? On that fatal day, Courtney noticed that Christian had turned off the location tracking on his phone when he went out for sandwiches. This detail became another reason for conflict, as jealousy and distrust were constant companions in their relationship. When Christian returned a few hours later, he turned the geolocation back on, but it did not appease Courtney. Obsession with a partner and the desire to control their every step are clear signs of a toxic and abusive relationship. When trust disappears and jealousy becomes all-consuming, it can lead to tragic consequences. Between 4:43 p.m. and 4:49 p.m., Courtney called her mother twice. The first conversation lasted 6 minutes and the second 7 minutes. And it was in the interval between these calls that the irreparable happened. Courtney struck Christian with a serrated kitchen knife. Courtney's mother claimed that she heard her daughter repeating that Christian was lying about something. This phrase may indicate a tense atmosphere and a conflict that was unfolding at that moment. Only at 4:57 p.m. did Courtney finally call 911, summoning an ambulance. At the same time, neighbors, alarmed by the noise, reported the incident to the building's security service, which in turn called the police. The delay in calling emergency services after a violent incident always raises suspicions. Why didn't Courtney immediately call 911 if it was self-defense? Every minute was worth its weight in gold when it came to saving Christian's life. It seems strange that between the attack on Christian and the 911 call, Courtney contacted her mother again. Perhaps she was seeking support or advice in this critical situation, while her boyfriend was bleeding out. When medics arrived at the crime scene, Christian had already lost a lot of blood. Despite all the efforts of the doctors, his life could not be saved. He died in the hospital. During questioning, Courtney categorically denied inflicting knife wounds on Christian. Instead, she claimed that it was Christian who attacked her, and she, defending herself, threw a knife at him from a distance of about 3 meters. According to her, she did not intend to harm him, but only wanted to scare him. Courtney's version of self-defense and accidentally throwing a knife from a distance of 3 meters seems highly doubtful. Firstly, hitting a moving person with a knife from such a distance is practically impossible without special training. Secondly, the nature of the wounds indicated a targeted strike at close range, not an accidental hit. The forensic expert who performed the autopsy on Christian's body also refuted Courtney's version. In his professional opinion, inflicting such a knife wound from a distance of 3 meters could only be done by a professional knife thrower, not an ordinary girl. However, Courtney continued to insist on her testimony. Interestingly, despite the seemingly luxurious and carefree life of the couple, there are several strange facts in their biography. For example, a few months before the incident, Courtney was behind on rent for the luxurious apartment. The matter went so far that on March 21, 2022, the Miami court issued a decision to evict her for non-payment. A logical question arises. If Courtney was really earning such big money, why couldn't she pay for the housing she herself chose to live in? There are also some facts from Courtney's past that draw attention. In 2018, another woman from Austin sued her for inflicting bodily injuries and material damage as a result of a car accident. This case was settled out of court, and in 2022, shortly before the tragedy with Christian, Courtney was arrested in Texas for driving under the influence. This was already the second such offense in her biography. Although these incidents are not directly related to Christian's murder, they demonstrate certain behavioral patterns and problems with the law in Courtney's life. A propensity for aggressive driving and alcohol abuse may indicate general instability and destructive tendencies. Friends of the couple said that at the beginning of the relationship, Courtney and Christian were truly in love and happy. But over time, their relationship became toxic and unhealthy. Constant quarrels, jealousy, insults, and even physical violence became common companions of their life together. The couple regularly broke up and got back together, unable to break this vicious cycle. Any little things could become a reason for conflict, such as Christian looking at another girl. Courtney, who abused alcohol, became especially aggressive and uncontrollable at such moments. Christian's friends noticed that due to constant scandals and insults from the girl, he became more withdrawn and distant. Courtney herself actively tried to isolate the guy from his family and friends. Acquaintances of the couple also told about repeated cases of physical violence by Courtney. She could push, hit, or even spit in Christian's face during an argument. Once, the girl even pushed him down the stairs at a house party. In moments of particular rage, Courtney would literally smash everything around her like a hurricane. Despite this, Christian continued to believe in the relationship and hope for the best. He wrote messages to Courtney saying that he loved her and wanted to work on the relationship. Moreover, when the girl's career took off, Christian became her personal assistant. He helped with the shooting schedule, organizing photo shoots, and so on. Courtney even promised him a percentage of the income from her OnlyFans page. Christian's behavior is a typical example of an abuse victim who continues to justify their abuser and hope for change. He was emotionally dependent on Courtney and could not break out of the toxic bond, despite the numerous manifestations of aggression on her part. From time to time, Courtney seemed to try to make amends for the violence with generous gifts for Christian. However, this was more manipulation than sincere remorse. Verbal apologies from the girl were out of the question. Instead, she created the illusion that expensive presents could compensate for the insults and pain inflicted, and Christian fell into this trap again and again. This pattern of behavior is a typical cycle of violence in abusive relationships. Periods of escalation and aggression are replaced by a honeymoon phase, when the abuser tries to make amends with gifts and promises to change. But without awareness of the problem and professional help, this only leads to an escalation of the conflict. Christian's friends also noted that the more fame and money Courtney gained, the less often she was sober. The girl abused not only alcohol, but also, probably, narcotic substances. This only intensified her unstable emotional state and outburst of aggression. One of the most shocking videos that sheds light on the true nature of the relationship between Courtney Clooney and Christian Obams was captured by a surveillance camera in the private elevator of their building. In the recording, it is clearly visible how Courtney repeatedly hits Christian in the face and also aggressively pulls his hair. At the same time, Christian does not resist and even tries to calm the enraged girl. This video recording is indisputable evidence of domestic violence by Courtney. The fact that such incidents occurred even in public places, such as an elevator, indicates a sense of complete impunity and lack of boundaries in her behavior. Christian's reaction is a typical example of an abuse victim trying to avoid escalation of the conflict by appeasing the aggressor. But the most shocking revelation was that 2 months before Christian's murder, in February 2022, Courtney cheated on him. It turns out that her own infidelity and guilt were the real reason for the morbid jealousy and control towards Christian. By projecting her own unfaithfulness onto her partner, Courtney was probably trying to justify her own destructive behavior. This betrayal became another reason for a scandal, during which Courtney grabbed a knife and tried to injure Christian in the face. Although she did not manage to hit the target, she cut his throat instead. The wound turned out to be quite serious, and Christian had to have stitches. In addition to physical violence, Courtney regularly kicked Christian out of their shared apartment and humiliated him with racist insults. This behavior is a manifestation not only of the toxicity of the relationship, but also of deeply rooted prejudices and discrimination. Despite all these alarming facts, Courtney's lawyers persistently tried to get her released on bail before the start of the trial. During the court hearings in December, the girl displayed ostentatious emotionality and cried in front of the jury. Her defense built a strategy on the fact that the murder of Christian was an act of self-defense, and Courtney herself became a victim of domestic violence. However, the judge did not succumb to these manipulations and denied release on bail. Attempts to present Courtney as a victim, despite numerous evidence of her aggressive and controlling behavior, is a typical defense tactic in such cases. Manipulation of emotions, attempts to shift the blame onto the victim, all this is designed to sow doubt in the jury and gain leniency. But the facts remain facts, and they are clearly not on Courtney's side. At the time of the tragedy on April 3, 2022, there was no doubt that it was Courtney Clooney who took Christian Obams's life. The only question that still needed an answer was whether it was a premeditated murder or an act of self-defense. Courtney herself continued to insist on her innocence and shift responsibility onto the victim. Currently, the girl is in a Florida prison awaiting the final verdict of the court. Her behavior during interrogations raises many questions and surprises. Before the investigator arrived, Courtney talked to herself and allegedly prayed for Christian, although her clothes were completely soaked in his blood. When the detective finally appeared, she apologized for her appearance, as if that was the biggest problem at that moment. Even stranger was Courtney's reaction to the news of Christian's death. When a law enforcement officer informed her of this news, she began to dramatically gasp for air and grab her head. Although people react differently to grief, her behavior seemed unnatural and exaggerated. And the most shocking moment was when Courtney asked to hug one of the investigators, as if seeking comfort and support from him. Courtney's behavior during the interrogation raises many questions about her mental state and the sincerity of her emotions. Her actions seem strange, inadequate to the situation, and possibly calculated to evoke sympathy. But knowing the backstory of her relationship with Christian, these attempts at manipulation look especially cynical and outrageous. Throughout the interrogation, Courtney kept repeating that she needed to hug her mom, that the detectives were joking with her, and that this was all just some terrible dream. She refused to acknowledge the reality of what had happened and take responsibility for what she had done. Christian's family, filled with grief and indignation, filed a civil lawsuit against Courtney. They demand compensation from her for all expenses related to the funeral and court proceedings. But most importantly, they seek justice and recognition of the suffering they endured through the loss of a son and brother. Courtney's lawyers, in turn, continue to appear on television and insist on the version of self-defense, portraying their client as a victim of circumstances. Attempts by the defense to present Courtney as a victim in this story look particularly cynical against the backdrop of all the evidence gathered. Even if we assume that there was mutual violence in their relationship, the facts indicate that it was Courtney who is the main aggressor and the toxic element. Her desire to control, humiliate, and dominate her partner cannot be justified by any circumstances. Undoubtedly, this case will long be the subject of discussion and research. Perhaps experts will never be able to come to an unambiguous conclusion about who is the main abuser in this relationship. But now, when Courtney is behind bars awaiting a verdict, her attempts to manipulate the system and public opinion look particularly unacceptable. Regardless of the final decision of the court, this tragic story should serve as a reminder to all of us about the importance of healthy, safe, and equal relationships. Domestic violence, toxicity, and abuse are problems that require serious attention and decisive action from society. We cannot allow such situations to remain without proper response and punishment for the guilty. Only in this way can we prevent new victims and build a more harmonious world for all. Meet the Dwayne twins, Allison and Ann. The women were born in Utica, New York. In 1978, they also had an older sister named Amy who was 3 years their senior. When the twin girls were 5 years old, their mother Miriam passed away, leaving them to grow up without maternal love and care. The girls were twins, almost identical in facial features and personalities, but there were differences between them. Allison had a more dominant personality and was a leader, while Anne, unlike her sister, was more reserved, balanced, sweet and kind. Like all twins, the girls did everything together, were inseparable, and sometimes it seemed abnormal how well they could sense each other, as if they had telepathy between them. They could understand what the other needed at any moment, or what the other was about to say before she said it. They were very close and loved each other dearly, but at the same time, there was a kind of toxic, perverse relationship between them, bordering on hatred. Those who knew the twins were amazed at how they could sense each other. If one started to speak, the other could finish her sister's sentences, but throughout their lives, the sisters would fight each other like crazy. Their lives were full of ups and downs, quarrels and terrible fights, then moments of love, and then it would all repeat. Of course, the absence of their mother left an imprint on them, but time passed, the sisters grew up, and in their teens, the girls became interested in yoga, which should have had a beneficial effect on the twins, calming them down and stopping their fights. Indeed, externally, everything seemed quite peaceful. The twins' fascination with yoga led them to the idea of starting their career by opening a joint yoga studio. They found a suitable place around Palm Beach, Florida, invested money, and in 2008 they opened a studio for those who wanted to practice yoga, called Double Power Yoga. This studio opened in 2008, existed for a fairly long period until 2014. The studio immediately became popular. Within 2 months, the yoga school had gained fame in the city, attracting a large number of people who wanted to practice, and the sisters became recognizable personalities, making acquaintances with influential people. The twins' business brought in a good income, and over time the sisters bought identical Porsche cars, which they drove around the city. The girls started living in an elite high-rise building in Palm Beach, dressing in fashionable salons, and continued to spread the idea of practicing yoga, telling everyone how much yoga can help in life. The sisters said that their yoga studio in Palm Beach was the heartbeat of the entire area. The yoga school was thriving, but behind the scenes, where outsiders couldn't see, the relationship between the sisters remained the same as in childhood. They quarreled and fought like teenage girls. As the twins' yoga studio was gaining popularity, they were approached with an offer to star in a reality show that would be about the studio run by twins, as well as about all the dramas in their lives. But for some reason, the release of this project stalled, but the producers, convincing the sisters that the show would definitely be released and that it would be necessary to show the sisters' success, persuaded the girls to rent a more beautiful and spacious premises for yoga classes, and the sisters followed this advice. Despite the fact that the show never materialized, the twins moved to a studio that was more pleasant for them, but the maintenance costs increased and they could no longer fully cover them. Getting a good fee for participating in the show didn't work out for the sisters, and the bills were huge. They gradually began to get into debt, which further aggravated the situation, and in 2014 it was decided to close the studio. The sisters closed the studio in a very peculiar way. They just left. The sisters just abandoned the classes, didn't show up at the studio, didn't pay the employees, didn't return people's money for their participation. And this angered society and turned it against the sisters, because those who came to practice at the studio felt simply robbed. Therefore, the twin sisters left the city and moved to Utah Park City, Utah, and also changed their names, as they planned to write a book in the future, and their names were too well known and frequently appeared on the internet. Because of the failure with the yoga studio, the sisters wanted to start from scratch. Allison changed her name to Alexandria, and Anne became Anastasia. Having settled in a new place, the girls opened another yoga studio, but they no longer had the same success as the first time. Their studio failed, and as a result, the twins found themselves in debt for $150,000 and became bankrupt. At the same time, the relocation, debts, and bankruptcy were accompanied by stress and worries, and the twins began to quarrel more than usual, and to relieve stress, they began to resort to alcohol more often. According to eyewitnesses, while the girls lived in Utah Park City, neighbors repeatedly called the police on them because the sisters drank a lot, loudly argued, and fought. Apparently, the twins were going through very difficult times during this period, were depressed, experiencing depression, and they didn't like living in Utah, so in the end, they packed all their things and went to the most beautiful place on earth, Hawaii. This was in 2015, and interestingly, when the twins said they were going to Hawaii, they added that they were going on a real pilgrimage, ride through holy places, and want to search for the meaning of life. But as soon as the sisters reached their destination, they again faced problems and got into trouble. One time, or rather on Christmas Eve, Alexandria and Anastasia decided to celebrate Christmas in a fun way. As usual, they didn't know when to stop with alcohol. The feast took place in a restaurant where the girls got pretty drunk and, of course, quarreled. Having decided to go home, they, however, did not stop arguing and already near the car began to swear so fiercely that they lost control and drove into a ditch. This happened very close to the restaurant, and the consequences could have been very serious. Fortunately, when the police arrived at the scene, the sisters had already gotten out of the car safe and sound. However, instead of calming down, they continued to swear and even began to insult the restaurant owner. Not understanding what was happening and why they were so angry with him, the sisters, in their drunken frenzy, even threatened him with violence, saying, "We will send the mafia to you. Let them deal with you." Of course, such behavior did not go unnoticed. The police detained the belligerent sisters for hooliganism. As a result, a fine, and it seems a certain sobering up, because after this incident they seemed to calm down a little. Further events showed that pleasant changes also took place in the life of the twins. In 2016, they both found boyfriends and started dating guys. For Alexandria, it was Lonnie Dickerson, and Anastasia started a relationship with Federico Bailey. It would seem that personal life was getting better and the sisters finally found their happiness. But not everything was so cloudless. Once Federico and Anastasia decided to go on a hike. Alexandria was supposed to stay at home. While preparing for the trip and stocking up on groceries at the supermarket, Anastasia accidentally took her sister's credit card instead of her own. Deciding not to use someone else's card, she went back home to get her own. But suddenly Alexandria for some reason changed her mind and decided that she also wanted to join the hike. It is worth noting that Federico, unlike the sisters, perfectly understood the problems associated with alcohol and tried to protect the girls from unnecessary temptation. Therefore, during this trip, he strictly forbade taking any alcoholic beverages with them. But Alexandria, as always, did her own thing. She secretly took a bottle of wine with her and hid it well in the car. When Federico discovered the forbidden alcohol, he was very upset and disappointed. This find caused considerable tension between the participants of the hike. Anastasia, in turn, got angry with her sister for such an irresponsible act. As we can see, even on vacation, in the company of their loved ones, the sisters could not get rid of their old habits and again found themselves in the epicenter of conflict. It would seem that a bottle of wine is a trifle, but it is from such trifles that serious problems often begin. And something tells me that this incident was just the tip of the iceberg. What other surprises did the Duane sisters have in store for their companions during this trip? I will note that after that tense scene with the wine, the company, which consisted of sisters Alexandria and Anastasia, as well as Anastasia's boyfriend Federico, finally reached their destination. The campsite where they stopped was located in a surprisingly picturesque area, surrounded by wonderful views of wildlife. While the girls were unpacking their things, Federico decided to freshen up after the long road and went to the nearest spring. However, when he returned to the camp, he was surprised to find that neither the sisters nor their car were anywhere to be seen. It's hard to even imagine what he felt at that moment: confusion, anxiety, perhaps even fear for his companions. As it later turned out, while Federico was away, Alexandria and Anastasia for some reason decided to get in the car and drive down the road that led to Hana. This highway, by the way, is considered one of the most beautiful in the world, but at the same time one of the most dangerous. It winds between the rocks, sometimes resembling a serpentine more than a road. On one side is a solid stone wall, on the other is an abyss that takes your breath away just by looking at it. In addition, the sharp turns on this road often do not allow you to see if someone is approaching from the opposite direction. And if we add to this the fact that the route is not always well maintained and there are potholes, it becomes clear that traveling on it is a real challenge for the driver. But it seems that the Duane sisters were little concerned about all these dangers. They boldly, if not carelessly, raced along the winding road, paying no attention to either the beauty around them or the risks that lurked at every turn. And all this because they were preoccupied with another argument. It's hard to even imagine what they could argue about at such a crucial moment, because it's obvious that on this road you need to be as attentive and careful as possible. But despite everything, the sisters managed to notice a lonely woman on the side of the road who obviously needed help. Without much thought, they decided to give her a ride. On the way, they asked the hitchhiker where she was heading, and then dropped her off where she asked. It would seem that this good deed should have slightly diffused the atmosphere between the sisters, but as it turned out, it was quite the opposite. As soon as the unfortunate passenger left the car, a simply terrible quarrel broke out between Alexandria and Anastasia, and it happened in the most dangerous place on one of the sharp turns. Later, one of the eyewitnesses of these events told me that he saw with his own eyes how in the car that was passing by, two girls were furiously waving their arms, punching each other with their fists and pulling each other's hair. The guy was dumbfounded by such a sight because he realized that these actions distracted the driver from driving the car, and on a road like the Raptahana at any moment. But despite the danger of the situation, the eyewitness realized that he could not help in any way. Everything happened so quickly that he wouldn't even have time to react. All he had left was to watch helplessly as the girl at the wheel suddenly accelerated sharply, turned the steering wheel to the left, and the car, breaking off the cliff, flew into the abyss. According to experts, the car fell from a height of about 60 meters and landed right on a pile of sharp stones. The most amazing thing is that it was the only area around the cliff where there was no water. It seems as if some unknown force specifically directed the car to this particular spot. From the strong impact, the car overturned and fell on its roof, so that its license plates were facing the sky. And you know, in this tragic situation, there is one moment that can be called a real miracle. It turns out that the girls were not driving some small car, but a Ford Explorer, a fairly large vehicle. Experts say that if they had been in a smaller car, they would have had practically no chance of surviving. News of the accident spread like wildfire through the surrounding area. The route leading to Hana is quite popular, so people began to gather around the scene of the incident. Everyone looked down in horror at the mangled car lying among the rocks. Someone even called the rescue service by dialing 911. And here the second amazing moment in this story happened. The people who had gathered on the cliff suddenly noticed that someone was moving in the car. It was an almost unbelievable piece of news. It turns out that after such a terrible fall, someone still survived. The police, who arrived at the scene of the accident, immediately began to question numerous witnesses, trying to find out what had happened. And one detail immediately caught their attention. It turns out that on the road surface there were clearly visible traces of tires from the Duane sisters' car. But the strangest thing is that these traces had no signs of braking before the car flew off the cliff. On the contrary, everything indicated that the driver deliberately accelerated and directed the car straight to the edge of the cliff. You must agree that such things do not happen by chance. Meanwhile, rescuers were delivered by helicopter to the scene of the tragedy to check if anyone was left alive in the twisted car. What they saw in the car interior shocked even experienced experts. One of the sisters, Anastasia, was dead. Her body had numerous fractures, and one of the paramedics even compared it to a bag filled with bone fragments. But the real miracle was that the second sister, Alexandria, survived. True, she also had a lot of serious injuries, several broken ribs and a damaged arm. But despite everything, when the girl was pulled out of the wrecked car, she was able to stand on her own feet. And here we come to the most mysterious moment of this story. When the rescuers freed Alexandria from the car, they noticed that she had a lock of blonde hair clenched in her hand, the same color as her dead sister's hair. Most likely, this hair was torn out during the fight that the random eyewitness saw shortly before the accident. But what shocked the investigators the most was Alexandria's behavior. She did not look either frightened or upset about what had just happened. It seemed that the girl was not at all bothered by the fact that she had just miraculously escaped after the car fell from the cliff. And most oddly, she never once asked about her sister's condition, did not ask if Anastasia had survived. Alexandria did not cry, did not sob, did not show her emotions at all. You must agree that such a reaction is on the verge of normal, and it was this that made the investigators wonder. Does this terrible accident hide some terrible secret? Perhaps what happened on the road to Hana was not an accident. After that fatal accident, Alexandria was immediately taken to the hospital. And it was there that she was found by the police, who arrived to conduct an interrogation. From the very beginning, it was clear that the girl was not too willing to cooperate with the investigation. She reluctantly answered questions, and her whole demeanor indicated irritation and dissatisfaction with the presence of the officers. Just imagine the first thing she said to them was, "Why are you here?" You know, during my many years as a detective, I've interrogated a lot of witnesses and suspects, and usually people who have just experienced such a terrible tragedy behave differently. They may be shocked, scared, upset, but indifference is the last thing you expect in such a situation. And another detail that surprised me a lot during the entire conversation with the police officers, Alexandria never once asked about her sister's condition. No worries, no anxiety, absolutely nothing. In the end, the investigators had to inform the girl about Anastasia's death themselves. And you know what struck me the most? The complete absence of any reaction from Alexandria. She listened to this terrible news with a completely empty, indifferent look without a hint of emotion. You must agree that this is more like the behavior of a person who has long come to terms with the loss, and not one who has just lost the closest person in an instant. But Alexandria's strange reaction is not the biggest surprise in this story. When the twins' father found out about the tragedy, his first words were, "It's a pity that the wrong sister died." That's right, you didn't mishear. The man actually regretted that Anastasia died in the accident and not Alexandria. Such an attitude towards one's own children is, to put it mildly, alarming. Meanwhile, the police continued the investigation and quickly found out that the sisters were fighting right in the car before the accident. This information made the investigators wonder, was the car's fall from the cliff actually Alexandria's deliberate act? Maybe she purposely directed the car towards the abyss to get rid of her sister. Even more suspicions were aroused by the results of the tests, which showed that the level of alcohol in Alexandria's blood was 3 times higher than the permissible norm. That is, the girl was actually heavily drunk behind the wheel and had no right to drive at all, let alone go on such a dangerous trip. The situation was complicated by the fact that at the time of the accident, the girls had no documents with them. It was because of this that the police had to rely on Alexandria's words to establish the identity of the deceased. And the girl, meanwhile, was forced to go home to find her ID and prove that she was indeed herself. The investigators also turned to Lonnie Dickerson, Alexandria's boyfriend, with a request to confirm her identity. When Lonnie was told about the accident and Anastasia's death, his reaction was no less strange than Alexandria's. It seemed that this news did not touch him at all. He just looked at the police officers with an empty, indifferent look. But Federico, Anastasia's boyfriend, was completely unaware of the tragedy. He was still waiting for the girls at the campsite, not understanding where they could have gone. Only the next morning, having got to his friend's place in Hana by hitchhiking, Federico learned the terrible truth. The news of his beloved's death was a real shock for him. The guy was extremely upset and confused, but suddenly remembered something. And believe me, this information greatly interested the investigation. Undoubtedly, the information provided by Federico was a real sensation for the investigation. He said that a week before the tragedy, Alexandria openly stated her intention to kill Anastasia. Moreover, at one point she even said, "I got rid of her," as if the murder had already happened. Such words could not but cause serious concern. True, Federico could not say for sure the reason why Alexandria wished death to her sister. But he suggested that there was a very strong rivalry and mutual jealousy between the girls because of each other's successes. It was hard for the twins to come to terms with the fact that they were so similar in appearance, and this forced them to constantly compete and oppose each other. Federico said that the sisters were constantly trying to outdo each other to prove their uniqueness. It was as if they wanted to tell the world, "Look, we may look like 2 peas in a pod, but we are different personalities." But despite this, the girls could not stay away from each other for long. Their relationship was a strange combination of love and hate, tenderness and aggression. When they were together, they constantly quarreled and insulted each other, but as soon as they were apart, they already missed their other half. But the strangest thing is that Federico recalled that once, after another heated argument, Alexandria told him, as if in passing, "My sister and I will leave this planet on the 30th. When the guy heard this, he thought that maybe the girls had decided to commit suicide together. But life went on as usual, and gradually this phrase was erased from Federico's memory. Upon hearing such a confession, the investigators became seriously alarmed. A terrible picture began to emerge in their heads. Alexandria deliberately drove the car into the abyss to kill her sister. Of course, one could assume otherwise, for example, that the girls decided to settle scores with life together, or that it was just a tragic coincidence, an accident. But something told the detectives that the answer lay precisely in Alexandria's words, which Federico heard. So the investigators decided to take a closer look at the Duane sisters' car. Fortunately, it was a new, modern car with many technical gadgets, and most importantly, it had a black box like in airplanes. This device records all information about the movement of the car, speed, maneuvers, change of direction, and so on. Thanks to the data from the black box, it was possible to find out an extremely important detail. At the moment the car fell, the brakes were not used. That is, the car was flying off the cliff at full speed. No one even tried to stop, or at least slow down. For the investigators, this was direct evidence that the accident was not an accident. Suspicions were intensified by the fact that the car fell into the abyss exactly where there were only sharp stones at the bottom and not water. It seemed as if someone had specifically chosen this spot for the fall. Moreover, it was here, on this stretch of road, that for some reason there was no protective fence. Everything seemed to come together for the implementation of someone's sinister plan. Experts made another interesting conclusion: Alexandria survived thanks to the deployment of airbags. But Anastasia was not so lucky. She jumped and bumped a lot in the cabin during the fall. Someone even suggested that if at the time of the accident the girl was pulling her sister by the hair, then Alexandria could quite possibly involuntarily turn the steering wheel and press the gas. Having received such testimony and evidence, the investigators decided to bring an official charge against Alexandria. There was only one question left: what motive pushed the girl to such a terrible act? It turns out that shortly before the tragedy, Federico and Anastasia were planning to open their own business on another Hawaiian island. And here we come to a possible motive for the crime. According to the testimony, Alexandria was extremely dissatisfied with the fact that her sister was going to leave her. The girl was so strongly opposed to parting with her twin that she may have decided to resort to the most radical measures. Having gathered all the circumstantial evidence, the investigation was finally able to bring an official charge against Alexandria, the intentional murder of her sister, that is, a second-degree crime. But when the police arrived to arrest the suspect, it turned out that she had already fled the house. It seems that the girl somehow guessed about the possible arrest and decided to hide from justice. But Alexandria apparently forgot about one simple thing: Maui is an island, and you can only leave it in two ways, by sea or by air. So it wasn't too difficult for the police to find out that the girl had booked a plane ticket and that her flight was about to depart. And you know, sometimes fate can be surprisingly ironic. By some coincidence, it was on this plane that a mechanical malfunction occurred, and the departure had to be postponed. So instead of being hundreds of kilometers away from the crime scene, Alexandria was forced to stay very close, but she went to wait it out in a nearby hotel. And there she was eventually found and arrested by the police. During the preliminary hearing of the case, Alexandria did not plead guilty to the murder of her sister. And here I would like to draw your attention to one detail. In the footage from the courtroom, you can see that the suspect's hand was not bandaged, although she had previously complained about an injury. Some of those present even suggested that Alexandria could have exaggerated the severity of her injury in order to arouse sympathy from others. The day of the substantive trial came. A large jury gathered on Maui, and Alexandria was officially charged with killing her sister. For this, the girl was taken to Hawaii to personally face justice. The process began on January 29, 2018. At first, Alexandria looked very excited and scared. No wonder, after all, she was facing life imprisonment. One of the key witnesses in this case was the same random passerby who saw with his own eyes how the sisters were fiercely fighting in the car shortly before the accident. The man described in detail what he saw: how Anastasia pulled her sister by the hair, pulled her head to herself, and punched her with her fists. This testimony formed the basis of the defense's version, according to which Alexandria, being behind the wheel, could have lost control of the car from pain and shock. Allegedly not seeing the road clearly due to her sister's attack, the girl could have unintentionally directed the car into the abyss. Then Federico, the deceased Anastasia's boyfriend, was questioned on the witness stand. He spoke about Alexandria's strange and disturbing behavior after the tragedy. According to him, the girl tried to establish closer contact with him, suggested taking a shower together, began to wear her sister's things. Federico admitted that he was shocked and repelled by such actions. Despite the outward resemblance to his beloved, he categorically refused to get close to Alexandria. But despite all this testimony, the suspect's lawyers insisted that it was Anastasia who caused the fatal accident. Allegedly, by attacking her sister, she provoked her to rash actions. The defense also referred to the results of the examination, according to which the car's wheel was changed shortly before the accident, so one of the tires was completely smooth. Given that the road was wet that day, and the sister's car was initially swaying due to the fight inside the cabin, it could well have happened that Alexandria simply could not cope with driving on the slippery road. So the court faced a difficult question. What really happened that fatal day on the road to Hana? Was the accident really an accident caused by a combination of factors, or was there a malicious intent behind it? And most importantly, is Alexandria guilty of her sister's death? The answer to these questions was to be given by the jury. So after hearing all the available evidence, the judge reached a conclusion and announced his decision. According to it, Alexandria was not responsible for the accident and the death of her sister, and therefore she was immediately acquitted. In the judge's opinion, the accused lost control of the vehicle, and perhaps she did indeed turn on the left turn signal. But even if she did, the evidence shows that the car was being heavily shaken from side to side due to the fight inside the cabin. The judge noted that the mere probability that Alexandria could have driven the car into the abyss is not sufficient for a guilty verdict. This requires strong and indisputable evidence of intent, and in this case they were absent. Instead, eyewitness accounts and expert findings rather indicated that the accident was the result of a fatal coincidence of circumstances: bad weather conditions, a slippery road, lack of fencing in a dangerous area, and most importantly, a merciless fight between the sisters that distracted the driver from driving. As a detective, this court decision seems rather controversial to me. Is it possible to exclude intent in a situation where one sister openly threatened to kill the other? Can it be considered an accident that the crash occurred in the very place where there were only sharp rocks below? After all, isn't it strange that Alexandria, despite the death of her twin, behaved as if nothing special had happened? These questions will probably never have unambiguous answers. Opinions on Alexandria's guilt were divided. Some consider her a completely innocent victim of a tragic coincidence. For others, she remains the main suspect who managed to escape punishment by cunning. Alexandria herself insists on her non-involvement in what happened. According to her, she misses Anastasia very much and is deeply saddened by everything that happened. But whether she can be believed is another question. This story took place in the small town of Conyers, Georgia. The officer immediately called for backup and medical assistance at the scene of the tragedy. Arriving at the address Tasmay provided, the police saw another girl near the house, an exact copy of Tasmay. As it turned out, they were twin sisters, Tasmia and Jasmia. The girls were in a state of shock from what they had seen. They were immediately given first aid, trying to calm and stabilize them. Meanwhile, a group of police officers entered the house to examine the crime scene. Right from the doorstep, their attention was drawn to a long, bloody trail stretching from the door to the street. Judging by everything, the victim had tried to escape from the attacker, but he caught up with her and dragged her back into the house to finish his bloody deed. What the cops saw inside shocked even seasoned officers. On the floor, walls, and even the ceiling were brown bloodstains, evidence of a brutal massacre. It seemed as if someone had deliberately splattered blood all over the house. In my years of service, I've seen many crime scenes, but this picture was one of the most terrifying. The officers carefully examined the house room by room, searching for the victim's body and any evidence that could shed light on the identity of the killer. Eventually, in one of the rooms, they found what they were looking for: the mutilated body of 33-year-old Nikki Whitehead, the mother of the twin girls. I can't help but note the diligence with which the killer tried to cover up the traces of his crime. The entire house was literally flooded with blood, but it was clear that someone had tried to clean up, albeit unsuccessfully. To completely cleanse the crime scene in such a short time was practically impossible. Later, Officer Chrisman, one of the first to arrive on the call, admitted that in his entire career, he had never seen such a bloody scene. This place made a depressing impression even on hardened cops. During the house search, the body of 33-year-old Nikki Whitehead, the mother of the twin girls, was found in one of the rooms. She was lying in the bathtub in a pool of her own blood. The woman had become a victim of a brutal attack. Her body was literally riddled with numerous stab wounds. Especially horrifying was the fact that the victim's spinal cord was practically severed. It seemed as if the killer had struck this area with particular fury. The expert who arrived at the crime scene counted about 80 stab wounds on the deceased's body. It's hard to even imagine the agony the poor woman endured before her death. It was also strange that the towels from the bathroom had disappeared somewhere. Later, they were found in the washing machine, soaked in blood. It looks like the killer tried to get rid of these pieces of evidence, but in a hurry just shoved them into the machine. On the same day, a criminal case was opened under the murder article and an active search for the perpetrator began. The first to come under the scrutiny of the investigation were the victim's daughters Tasmia and Jasmia. During interrogation, the girls said that the house where they lived belonged to a man named Robert Head, with whom their mother had a relationship. But as it turned out, Robert was not Nikki's only admirer. The girls recalled overhearing their mother repeatedly talking on the phone with some Nikki Joe, especially when Head wasn't around. This fact interested the investigators and required further verification. Was Robert Head involved in the murder? What role did the mysterious Nikki Joe play? And most importantly, who actually committed this terrible act? Now I'm going to tell you all about this in detail, but only for those wonderful and amazing people who subscribe to the channel right now, like this video, and leave any comment on it. Help me spread this story so people can draw conclusions from this shocking case. So, during the interrogation of the victim Nikki Whitehead's daughters, new details of her personal life were revealed. Tasmia and Jasmia said that they had repeatedly heard their mother talking on the phone with some Nikki Joe, especially when her cohabitant Robert Head was not around. Interestingly, the girls themselves never saw Joe, including on the day of the tragedy. But the most intriguing fact was that on the eve of the murder, Nikki spoke again with this mysterious man, and then a serious quarrel broke out between them, after which the woman angrily slammed down the receiver. This detail immediately caught my attention as a detective. After all, it is quite possible that during that conversation, Nikki told her admirer about her desire to end their relationship, and such a decision could well become a motive for murder. How many times in my practice have I encountered similar situations a rejected lover commits a crime out of jealousy or resentment? Therefore, this version definitely needed to be checked. The police quickly found Nicky Joe and invited him for questioning. The man was genuinely surprised to learn the reason for the summons. He categorically denied his involvement in the murder and claimed that despite the one-sidedness of his feelings and the fact that Nicky kept him at a distance, he sincerely loved this woman and would never harm her. Joe confirmed that on the eve of the tragedy, he and Nicky really had a quarrel, but assured that it was a minor dispute over a misunderstanding, which was quickly settled. Moreover, according to him, for the entire day of January 13, he had an ironclad alibi that completely ruled out the possibility of committing this terrible crime. Well, Nicky Joe's interrogation left more questions than answers. If it wasn't him, then who was it? Another version began to form in my head. What if the murder was committed by Robert Head, the man Nicky Whitehead was living with at the time of the tragedy? Perhaps he found out about her secret communication with another man and decided to brutally take revenge on his unfaithful cohabitant. However, the version about Robert Head's involvement in the murder was quickly dropped. During the investigation, it was established that the man worked as a long-distance trucker and on the day of the tragedy was on a business trip in another state. So purely physically, he could not have been present at the crime scene and committed this terrible act. And so the cops found themselves at a dead end again. On the one hand, there was the mutilated body of a victim who died a terrible death. On the other hand, there was a complete absence of suspects or leads that could put us on the trail of the killer. As an experienced detective, I understood that in such cases you need to act methodically and not miss a single detail. The first thing law enforcement did was thoroughly search the crime scene and collect all possible evidence from blood traces to fingerprints and microfibers. All these samples were sent to the laboratory for examination. While they were waiting for the analysis results, it was decided to delve deeper into the personal life of Nicky Whitehead. It was necessary to find out who the deceased communicated with, what places she visited, what she was passionate about. The detectives were especially interested in the last weeks and days before the murder. Perhaps that's where the key to this horrifying story was hidden. And then Mickey's daughters Jasmia and Tasmia came to mind. After all, who could know more about a woman's life than her own children? The girls were the closest people to their mother and could remember some details or events that would help track down the criminal. The police decided to take the sisters to the station and carefully question them there in a calm environment. Of course, the girls had just experienced a terrible tragedy and were in a state of shock. On the way to the station, one of the patrolmen noticed Tasmia's strange behavior. She kept biting her hands hard until they bled. Her sister Jasmia explained that for Tasmia, this is a usual way to cope with nervous tension, especially in stressful situations. Like now, after such a shock, this is a completely normal reaction. During the interrogation, the detective began to have a vague, alarming feeling. At first, he attributed it to professional intuition, which often helped in investigations, but over time this feeling only intensified. First, the detective found it extremely suspicious that Tasmia and Jasmia seemed to be crying, but at the same time there was no trace of tears on their faces. It seemed as if they were squeezing out this cry, playing to the audience, which was quite strange given the circumstances. Secondly, the detective could not help but notice how the girls spoke about their deceased mother. In their words, there were harsh, even offensive epithets about Nicky. You know, usually children who have just lost their parents remember them with special tenderness and even some idealization. But here everything was different. It seemed as if the girls were talking about some stranger, or even a person they hated. And this led to certain thoughts. The longer the interrogation lasted, the more the detective became convinced that the sisters were hiding something. Whether out of fear or for some other reasons, but their testimonies constantly had some kind of understatement and contradictions. And this made us think, what if they themselves were somehow involved in this horrific story? In the end, the team of investigators decided to separate the girls and interrogate each one individually. Of course, they began to resist, begging not to separate them, but the investigators were adamant. Although it's not very pleasant to separate sisters who have just experienced such a tragedy, the interests of the investigation required this step. By the way, another interesting nuance, Tasmia and Jasmia did not take off their gloves the whole time, even inside the police station. At first glance, it's a trifle, but in the context of the investigation, every detail can be important. So after completing the interrogation of Tasmia and Jasmia, the cops had a mixed impression. On the one hand, the girls seemed to be frank and admitted that lately their relationship with their mother had been, to put it mildly, strained. They even confessed that they sometimes thought about Nikki's death, but at the same time they insisted that they were not involved in the murder. On the other hand, it seemed that they were still hiding something. There were too many inconsistencies when comparing their testimonies obtained during separate interrogations. It's like putting together a puzzle, the pieces of which just won't fit together. And such a mismatch usually indicates a lie or concealment. Suspicions about the sisters only intensified after one incident. After the interrogation, the girls were sitting in the department room, hugging each other and seemingly crying. One of the employees, taking pity on them, approached and sympathetically asked if he could help them with something, do something for them. And then the unexpected happened. The sisters replied that they would like to watch TV. This moment just threw me off balance. Usually, children who have just lost their mother under such terrible circumstances are under such stress that TV is not even a question. But here, as if nothing had happened, life goes on as usual. Such a reaction seems somehow unnatural, and it only heightened the doubts of law enforcement officers. In the end, the investigators came to the conclusion that it was necessary to talk with the entourage of the Whitehead family, their friends, neighbors, acquaintances, to ask them about how Nikki's relationship with her daughters was, what were the nuances of their family life. And you know, the very first conversations opened their eyes to many things. It turned out that during the interrogation, the girls significantly smoothed out the severity of intrafamily conflicts, presenting everything as if there were problems, but not too serious ones. However, reality turned out to be much gloomier. To begin with, Nikki Whitehead herself was not born in the most favorable conditions. At the time of giving birth, her mother was serving a sentence in prison for distributing prohibited psychotropic substances. So the little one was taken care of by her grandmother Della Frazier. The woman felt very sorry for the girl, believed that she was already unlucky with the imprisoned mother, so from childhood she indulged all the whims of her granddaughter. When Nikki grew up, she repeatedly got involved with bad company and came to the attention of the police. Fortunately, somehow it did without serious consequences, but the fact remains the childhood and youth of the future victim were far from ideal. As for Della Frazier herself, after the detectives communicated with her, the impression was formed that this woman was excessively indulgent to the antics of her granddaughters. Perhaps she loved them in her own way, but she absolutely did not know how to keep them within the framework of discipline to resist their whims. So the girls got used to the fact that their grandmother allows and indulges everything. All this only emphasizes the unhealthy atmosphere in which the sisters grew up. As it turns out, at the age of 17, she gave birth to twins Tasmia and Jasmia. Almost nothing was known about the girls' father, only that shortly after their birth, he married another woman and moved to Canada, actually leaving the children to fend for themselves. According to eyewitnesses, despite her young age, Nikki sincerely rejoiced in motherhood and loved her daughters very much. But the trouble was that without a job and her own housing, the young mother was forced to give the little ones to her grandmother for upbringing, and she herself went to earn money. In fact, for several years she disappeared from the life of Tasmia and Jasmia, only rarely visiting them and sending money. But the immediate upbringing of the girls was carried out exclusively by the grandmother. Interestingly, despite such difficult circumstances, the sisters grew up to be very smart and diligent. According to teachers at school, they demonstrated remarkable success, were excellent students. In addition, they were engaged in art circles, participated in the Scout movement. And Della Frazier herself did not hide that she dreams of a brilliant future for her granddaughter's admission to prestigious universities, a decent career. It would seem that despite her daughter's early pregnancy and her irresponsibility, the woman managed to raise the girls properly. But as often happens, behind the screen of well-being, a completely different reality was hidden. After talking with family acquaintances, the investigators realized that Della made the same mistake that she once did with Nikki. She brought up her granddaughters in an atmosphere of permissiveness and indulgence of whims. That is, if at school the girls behaved flawlessly, then at home they did not listen to their grandmother at all, did not recognize any rules or restrictions, and the woman could do nothing about it. But the real problems began when Robert Head appeared in Nikki's life. Although the man was much older than her, Nikki sincerely fell in love with him and soon moved in with him. And then she decided to take her daughters to live with her, filing a corresponding lawsuit in court. And the court sided with her when the girls were 7 years old. They moved to their mother and her new cohabitant. It would seem that finally the children were reunited with their own mother. They had a full-fledged home. But not everything was so cloudless. Robert, who worked as a long-distance trucker, was often away, and while he was absent, the girls seemed to break loose. Accustomed to permissiveness at their grandmother's, now they took Nikki's attempts to discipline them, to teach them at least some rules with hostility. They openly rebelled against the routine established by their mother, although in fact it was quite reasonable lessons, limited time for walks, no gadgets before bed, and so on. But the girls were not going to put up with such oppression. According to neighbors, they tried in every possible way to circumvent their mother's prohibitions, and when she discovered disobedience, they quarreled with her through tantrums. It got to the point that Nikki began to take away phones from her daughters and forbid them to watch TV for their misdeeds. For girls who were used to freemen at their grandmother's, this was a real drama, and they openly declared that they were not going to endure it. So slowly, day by day, the conflict between mother and daughters only escalated, and I understood that this discord could result in something worse than just quarrels and tantrums. It remained only to guess how far could the girls go to finally throw off the maternal shackles. Be that as it may, Nikki Whitehead did not give up. Even at 25, having become the mother of 2 already adult girls, she tried to build the right model of life for them. Yes, sometimes it was not easy for her, and the methods were sometimes too harsh, but the woman sincerely strove to give her daughters what she herself did not receive at their age. Having obtained custody of the children, Nikki immediately established clear rules. Right after school lessons, time for walks and entertainment was strictly limited. At night, no phones or other gadgets. Complete obedience and submission to the mother. For any offense, punishment, from confiscation of equipment to a ban on watching TV. For girls who had lived for years in the permissiveness of their grandmother's upbringing, this came as a real culture shock. At some point, Robert Head, Nikki's cohabitant, witnessed one of these quarrels, and then a completely different relationship developed between him and the girls. When the man was at home, they behaved restrainedly, even a little afraid of him. But as soon as Robert left for another trip on a long-distance truck, the sisters seemed to break loose. Conflicts with their mother literally happened every day. The woman desperately tried to cope with her rebellious daughters, but where they're in her hands, they openly laughed at her attempts to educate them, to set some kind of framework. This daily struggle drained Nikki morally and physically. She was torn between work and the constant need to rein in her disobedient girls. But even then, the thought occurred to me, was this pedagogy limited only to moral pressure and strict punishments? Perhaps in the heat of another conflict, it even came to assault. At least some family acquaintances hinted that sometimes quarrels moved into a dangerous phase. But what really happened there behind closed doors remained only to guess. It would seem that after so many conflicts and even police intervention, the situation should have somehow improved. But no, the quarrels between Nikki and her daughters only escalated. Once, after another call, my colleagues again came to the Whitehead house, and they found a familiar picture there. A frightened Nikki claimed that her daughters had attacked her with their fists as soon as the door closed behind the police. However, something didn't add up in this story. When the cops went upstairs to the sisters' room, they unanimously assured that it was their mother who attacked them, not the other way around. Only the girls' words sounded extremely unconvincing. Unlike Nikki, whose hands were covered with fresh scratches and bruises, there was not a single abrasion on Tasmia and Jasmia, and this led to certain reflections. In the end, the girls were taken to the police station that day, and later a trial was held over them. Having weighed all the circumstances, the servants of Themis came to the conclusion that it would be better for the daughters to return to the care of their grandmother, and they should be temporarily isolated from Nikki. It was thought that Della Frazier would be able to curb her unruly granddaughters. But no, even this indulgent woman could not handle the sisters who had completely gotten out of hand. They openly neglected her authority, did everything their own way, regardless of comments or requests. And with age, their behavior became more and more aggressive. The girls repeatedly came to the attention of the police due to minor offenses and clashes. At the same time, Della continued to desperately make excuses for them, despite the obviousness of the problem. The woman sincerely loved her granddaughters and justified them in everything. But child protection specialist understood. The elderly Mrs. Frazier no longer has the strength and ability to raise 2 teenagers with such deviations. Someone was needed who could take the girls under strict but fair control. And then all eyes again turned to Nikki Whitehead. Despite all the complexity of her relationship with her daughters, she remained their mother and great hopes were pinned on her. So at the beginning of 2010, when the sisters turned 16, another court session took place. Its verdict was as follows. The girls must return to their mother for 2 weeks, a kind of probationary period. There were rumors that during this time, the supervisory authorities repeatedly visited Nikki's house to make sure that everything was okay, and allegedly there were no changes. The girls remained just as disobedient and problematic. However, the guardianship specialists stubbornly turned a blind eye to this. They hoped that during these 2 weeks, the daughters would somehow come to an understanding with their mother, find a common language. But as it turned out, Tasmia and Jasmia themselves were extremely dissatisfied with this decision. They unanimously declared that they did not want to live under the same roof with Nikki, that they preferred to stay with their grandmother. It seemed that the prospect of spending at least a few weeks with their own mother caused them almost panic fear. And in my opinion, such a reaction was very indicative. But no matter how much the girls protested, no one listened to them. Everyone around stubbornly believed that these 2 weeks would be fateful for the Whitehead sisters, that it was during this time that they would finally come to an understanding with their mother, begin a new life as a normal, healthy family. How could they have imagined then what a horrific surprise awaited them in the near future? And so, after long vicissitudes and disputes, Tasmia and Jasmia still found themselves in the house of their mother Nikki Whitehead and her cohabitant Robert Head. The girls had just turned 16 and they were to spend 2 fateful weeks with their mother, a kind of probationary period that was to determine their future life. But fate decreed otherwise. Just 8 days after the start of this experiment, the irreparable happened. Nikki was found dead in her own home. The woman became a victim of a brutal murder, the circumstances of which shocked even seasoned police officers. Since all the evidence against the Whitehead sisters was indirect and circumstantial, the girls had to be released. They returned to their adored grandmother and at first glance began to live their usual life, the same as they led before their mother took them to live with her for the last time. According to relatives and neighbors, the girls became simply inseparable. If before they spent a lot of time together anyway, now they did not leave each other for a single step at all, as if they were afraid of getting lost or losing that invisible but strong sisterly bond. But the change in their behavior was most striking. If before the tragedy Tasmia and Jasmia were rather noisy and problematic girls, now they behaved quietly and calmly. Against the backdrop of accusations and gossip that rained down on them after their mother's death, the sisters seemed to be trying to become as inconspicuous as possible. At school, they almost stopped communicating with their peers. Immediately after classes, they hurried home. It seemed that the girls deliberately avoided any contact with the outside world, as if fearing unwanted attention to their persons. Meanwhile, the investigation into the murder of Nikki Whitehead was delayed for many months. The investigation carefully collected and checked all possible evidence, interviewed witnesses, put forward versions. But despite all efforts, the case did not budge for a long time. It seemed as if the criminal had not left a single trace, a single clue that could be grasped. And so in May, the results of the examinations of the evidence collected at the crime scene finally came. For me, they did not become some kind of revelation, rather. They only confirmed those suspicions that arose immediately after acquaintance with the case. First, the bite marks on the hands of Tasmia and Jasmia perfectly matched the dental impressions of their murdered mother. Remember the episode when Tasmia suddenly began to bite her hand in the police car as if from severe stress? As it turned out, she did it not at all because of nervous tension. It was a desperate but extremely stupid way to mask the traces of her mother's teeth on her skin. Secondly, 2 boxes with their shoes were found in the sisters' room, on which traces of Nikki Whitehead's blood were clearly visible. And also that missing stack of towels from the bathroom, which I mentioned earlier. It was found stuffed into the washing machine, soaked in blood not only of the victim, but also of the twins themselves. These and other facts eloquently testified that it was not some mysterious malefactors who were involved in Nikki's death, but 2 people dear to her, Tasmia and Jasmia. Teenagers whom she so desperately tried to curb and put on the true path. Her own daughters. The only question that remained somewhat vague was the distribution of the sisters' roles in the commission of the crime. DNA examination was powerless to determine to which of the twins certain biological traces belonged. However, I had practically no doubt that the girls acted together and deliberately. The murder of the mother was not some tragic coincidence. It was planned and implemented as a well-organized and thought-out crime. Of course, the young age and the stunning cruelty of the deed could raise doubts. Are these delicate 16-year-old creatures really capable of such brutality? But unfortunately, my many years of practice show that anyone is capable of murder. And if a person has already decided to cross the line of law and morality, age and gender do not play the main role at all. Additional confirmation of this version was the video recording from the surveillance cameras of the school where the girls studied.
It clearly shows how on the day of the murder, January 13, Tasmia and Jasmia enter the educational institution together at 10:17 in the morning. That is, in fact, they are late for half of the lessons. This raised a lot of questions. After all, if everything was as the sisters told at first, they should have left the house at 7:30 and, in the worst case, been late for some half an hour. Instead, we see the absence of girls in several classes in a row, and this leads to certain reflections. What were they doing all this time? Where were they and what were they doing instead of sitting at their desks? Of course, at first the thought arose that Tasmia and Jasmia could simply skip classes like many other teenagers. But in the context of all the circumstances, this version looked unlikely. Unfortunately, it looked much more like the girls spent the morning hours implementing their horrific plan. Realizing the seriousness of the suspicions and the evidence collected, on May 21, our group went to the Whitehead Sister School. Right on the territory of the educational institution, in front of the stunned students and teachers, the detention of Tasmia and Jasmia took place. The girls were placed in an official car to be taken to the police station for further investigative actions, and here we witnessed a striking change in the behavior of the sisters. If earlier they pretended to be frightened and confused victims of circumstances, now they seemed to have dropped their masks. In the police car, the girls began to behave defiantly, even aggressively. They unanimously declared their non-involvement in the crime, accusing the cops of deliberately appointing them guilty in order to close the high-profile case as soon as possible. Even being in the police station, in the interrogation room, the sisters stubbornly refused to admit their guilt. It seemed that neither the iron evidence nor the psychological pressure was able to break through this wall of defiant silence. Tasmia and Jasmia sat side by side, tightly pursing their lips and looking at one point. In their eyes, one could read not only fright, but also some strange determination like that of people who have already made a fateful decision. Looking back, I think it was at that moment that we all finally saw the true face of the Whitehead sisters. Not frightened children, not victims of circumstances, but two young individuals capable of a brutal and insidious crime. Cold-blooded, prudent murderers despite their 16 years. On July 12, after a thorough study of all the evidence and circumstances of the case, Tasmia and Jasmia were officially charged for the premeditated murder of their mother, Nikki. The girls were taken into custody before the trial. Without the right to bail, the charges against them were too serious. But the most interesting thing happened a little later. Realizing that the weight of evidence against them was irrefutable, the sisters suddenly decided to confess, and what they told during the next interrogation made even us, seasoned police officers, shudder. According to the girls, when their stepfather Robert was away, Nikki often drank. Moreover, she did it not like a normal person who wants to relax with a glass of wine, but abused it in a big way. Tasmia and Jasmia even suggested that sometimes their mother indulged in illegal substances, so inadequate was her behavior at such moments. With tears in their eyes, the sisters told how their drunken mother picked on them for any reason, provoked scandals out of the blue, and also that even when sober, Mickey was very cold and detached with them. The girls did not see any warmth or maternal love from her. Furthermore, on the eve of the tragedy, another drunken quarrel occurred. Nikki, pretty tipsy, began to yell at her daughters, calling them names. The scandal lasted almost until the morning, and only in the morning, tired, they all fell asleep. But they were not destined to rest. Just a few hours later, Nikki again burst into the girls' room and began to wake them up. They say it's time for school. At the same time, she carelessly poked them with a spoon and mumbled something about studying and responsibilities. And when the sisters went down to the kitchen to have breakfast, another conflict broke out over nothing. Then the sisters told quite terrible things about how they, unable to withstand the bullying, attacked their mother with a knife, how they dealt blow after blow until she fell dead, how they dragged the bloody body to the bathroom to somehow cover their tracks, how they washed the floor with towels but still could not remove all the blood. And after this horrific cleaning, the girls simply changed clothes, hid their shoes with traces of blood away, and, as if nothing had happened, went to school. When asked why they did not immediately tell the truth, the sisters did not give a clear answer. They only shrugged their shoulders and looked away. At the trial, Tasmia and Jasmia fully admitted their guilt. Without unnecessary emotions or attempts to justify themselves, they simply confirmed everything that they said during the interrogations. For the premeditated murder of their mother, the Whitehead sisters were sentenced to 30 years in prison. Their lawyer stated that such a sentence gives the girls hope for the future. They say, if they had not admitted guilt, the term could have been much tougher. Interestingly, even after being behind bars, the sisters managed to finish their schooling. Their grandmother, Della Frazier, was present even at the graduation. Despite all the horror of what her granddaughters did, the old woman continues to love and support them. An amazing woman, in my opinion. In 2017, Tasmia and Jasmia filed a petition for parole, but fortunately they were denied. If they do not receive more parole, they will be released only in 2044 when both will already be 47. I hope that during this time they will realize the full weight of their crime and repent. Although, to be honest, it's hard to believe in it. This is such a terrible and eerie story, friends. A story about how hatred and cruelty can poison even the closest people. About how important it is to notice the alarming signs in time and react to them. And that nothing in this world justifies such a brutal crime, not even teenage maximalism or difficult family relationships.
Christy Marceau woke up from a sudden phone call. The girl was sleeping in her room. It was 10 a.m. on Tuesday, September 6, 2011, and the 18-year-old student from the University of Technology in Auckland, New Zealand, didn't need to get up early. The phone stopped ringing before Christy picked up the receiver. But then, a few seconds later, it rang again. The girl answered. A male voice on the other end of the line asked to speak to Christy. "This is Christy," the girl said. It turned out that the caller was her acquaintance, Akshay Chan. Until recently, they both worked at a local supermarket. They weren't friends, but they sometimes talked at work and outside of it, exchanging messages on Facebook. They lived just a few blocks apart, and Akshay had come to Christy's house a few times. He often needed someone to talk to about his personal problems. Kind and compassionate, Christy was always ready to listen to him. The girl knew that Akshay had been going through a tough time lately, but she couldn't imagine what he would say next. Her heart sank when he uttered, "I dissolved 40 tablets in a drink, and if you don't come to my house within 10 minutes, I will drink it." Without a second thought, the girl hurried to help Akshay. Christy was in such a rush after Akshay's call that she had hardly any time to get dressed. She quickly put on sweatpants and a sweater over her sleepwear, grabbed her keys and mobile phone, jumped into her car, and drove about a kilometer to Akshay's house. It was unusual for Christy to ignore a cry for help. She always tried to assist those who had a harder time in life. Unlike the sociable Christy, Akshay Chand didn't have many friends. Everyone recognized his extraordinary intellect, but he found it difficult to communicate with other kids, especially girls. When fate brought them together at work in a local supermarket, Akshay began sharing his inner struggles with her. The girl sympathized with him, but in June 2011, she started a new job and saw Akshay much less frequently. By the time he called her on September 6th, a considerable amount of time had passed since their last meeting. Christy had only 2 minutes to arrive at the apartment building where the guy lived with his mother and younger sister. She parked her car, rushed up the stairs, and knocked on the door. Akshay let her inside. Christy followed him through the entrance door, which he locked behind them. There was no one else at home. Akshay's mother was at work, and his 16-year-old sister was at school. As Christy sat down in a chair opposite him, she noticed a small amount of white powder on the table. It looked like someone had crushed tablets. Obviously, Chand hadn't lied when he mentioned the glass with the medication. Christy asked him where the drink was. "Do you think I'm that stupid?" He replied, "Of course, I hid it because I knew you would find it." Concerned, the girl tried to persuade Akshay to seek professional help. Her words disappointed him. From his perspective, Christy wasn't helping him cope with depression after she left the supermarket. Christy explained that she was torn between her university studies and her new job. But Chand argued that she could spare 5 minutes to chat with him on Facebook, and that would be enough. Then he added, "Let's face it, you weren't that busy." Christy became increasingly uneasy. The more he blamed her, the more she explained that she couldn't help him. He needed to reach out to a specialist. This angered Akshay even more. He jumped out of his chair and reached into his pocket for a kitchen knife. The knife was long and very sharp. Akshay held onto the handle tightly, brandishing it in front of Christy. "This is how we're going to do it," he said. "If you scream, I'll stab you with the knife." Christy began whimpering in response, prompting Chand to order her to be quiet and calm down. The girl still held onto her mobile phone, contemplating how to send a message to her friend asking for help. But Chand noticed the phone and demanded that she hand it over. Christy clung to her phone tightly, as if it were her only connection to the outside world. Failing to forcefully take the phone from her, Chand threatened the girl again, implying he would resort to using the weapon. He snatched the girl's mobile phone, and suddenly, Chand began to talk. He declared that he had big plans for the day. He decided to scare the girl, seek revenge on her for not supporting him during his most difficult period, and finally put an end to everything in one fell swoop. Then he demanded that Christy take off her sweater and hand it over to him. After searching through it, he demanded her blue top. The girl refused, but predictably, the guy threatened her with the knife. Christy complied. Then he ordered her to stand up and show that she wasn't hiding anything in her pants. She emptied her pockets, but it wasn't enough for him, and he wanted her to remove the sweatpants she was wearing. Christy refused and broke down in even greater tears. But realizing that she had no choice, she undressed, leaving herself only in her underwear. Chand crumpled her clothes into a pile, sat back in the chair, and began rambling about various things. He spouted nonsense about how people like Christy make others suffer. He accused her of coming to him only when it was already too late. Overall, more time had passed since Christy arrived at his place. Terrified, she asked if he planned to kill her. Chand reminded her of his plans for the day, to frighten her, seek revenge, and drink the prepared drink. He hadn't previously specified how he planned to seek revenge, but now he was ready to tell her. Akshay Chand wanted to violate Christy. Upon hearing this, the girl burst into tears, which prompted Chand to ask her to calm down. Then, out of the blue, he changed his mind. He returned Christy's clothes, phone, and told her she could leave. Still overwhelmed with fear, Christy initially didn't believe the sudden change in the guy's mood. What if he planned to stab her in the back, catching her off guard when she turned away? She shared her concerns with Chand, forcing him to lower the knife. "I'm letting you go, but you should know that as soon as you leave, I will drink the concoction," he said. Christy once again tried to persuade him to abandon this plan. Despite what he had put her through, her character didn't allow her to leave after such words. But Chand insisted. Too frightened to linger any longer, Christy turned around and ran out of the apartment. She hurried down the stairs to her car. Passers-by walked by, unaware of what had just happened to her. Christy wanted to ask one of them for help, but she realized she wouldn't feel safe until she reached home. Getting into her car, Christy locked the doors, started the engine, and drove home. From the perspective of Christy's parents, Brian and Tracy Marceau, she was their little miracle. After the birth of their first child, a girl named Heather, Tracy and Brian Marceau had been trying to become parents again. However, it took 6 years before Christy was born. By 2011, the very close-knit family members were living far apart. Heather had moved out of the family home a few years ago, and Brian was working in Australia. Tracy was planning to move to Australia soon to be closer to her husband. Christy was also looking forward to the move. As her first year at the University of Auckland's School of Hospitality and Tourism approached its end, where she was studying event management, she could continue her education in Australia. By the age of 30, the young woman dreamed of starting her own event planning company. Currently, she still lived in her parents' home, where she grew up in the suburb of Hillcrest. On the morning of the attack on Christy, Tracy was at work when her phone rang around 11:30 a.m. It was her mother, Shirley, who lived together with Tracy and Christy in the same house. Tracy answered, and in the background, she heard Christy's hysterical crying. Then she heard her mother's voice, telling her to come home immediately because Christy had been attacked. Tracy arrived home within 15 minutes. Upon seeing her mother, Christy threw herself into her arms and didn't want to let go. Trembling and crying incessantly, she recounted what Akshay Chand had done to her. Tracy hardly knew Akshay, but she remembered that once, While seeing off Brian at the airport, they returned home with their daughter and found him waiting at the doorstep. Akshay and Christy chatted briefly. Christy assured her mother that she just needed someone to talk to, but Tracy didn't like him right away. He evoked a strange feeling in her, and she asked her daughter to stop communicating with him. However, the girl was confident that there was nothing to worry about, and Tracy had never heard of Akshay again until this incident. Shocked by the details of what had happened, Tracy immediately took her daughter to the police station. In the police station, Christy repeated her account of the attack. She didn't know why Akshay had a change of heart and let her go, but she was certain that it wasn't the end and that he would attack her again because he had been stalking her for some time. She didn't tell her parents that she had found him sitting on the steps of her house on more than one occasion. At one point, he left a note for her in the mailbox, confessing his love and thanking her for the support she had provided, which he desperately needed. Chand also insisted that Christy accept a large sum of money as a gift. She took the money but didn't spend it, believing that he would demand it back. And indeed, a few days later, he did. When she left work at the supermarket, Chand quit his job on the same day, stating that he had no reason to stay there without her. After that, their communication ceased, and it became evident that Akshay had built up a lot of anger towards Christy, believing that she had abandoned him. The thought of him being out there frightened her, and the police recognized the danger she faced. As a result, Akshay Chand was promptly placed under arrest. Akshay admitted to everything and stated that the drink he threatened to consume contained multivitamins. However, he genuinely believed that consuming them in large quantities was toxic. In the police station, he calmly explained that his motive was revenge. Chand was angry at Christy because she didn't help him with his depression, and he openly expressed that he still harbored thoughts of vengeance. The police were extremely concerned about his behavior. It was a significant leap from someone who had never had any issues with the law to a criminal charged with abduction, attempted sexual assault, and threats of harm. Since he was still angry at Christy, the detectives knew it was crucial to keep Chand in custody until he could appear in court. They prepared a document outlining the reasons why Chand should not be released on bail, emphasizing Christy's fear and the proximity of their homes. They highlighted the fact that he could appear at her doorstep within minutes if he desired. 3 days after the attack, Akshay appeared in court. His lawyer argued that her client should be released on bail because he was only 18 years old. According to the law at that time, individuals over 17 but under 20 years old were typically eligible for bail if they had no prior convictions. Since Chand had never been arrested before, his lawyer claimed that he should be granted bail. She promised that he would take antidepressant medication, and if released on bail, his family would supervise him. However, the judge believed that it was not appropriate to release a person who had shown unwavering determination to carry out his actions. Despite the law, the judge stated that the only circumstance in which she would consider granting bail was if Chand agreed to be admitted to a psychiatric hospital. However, this option was unlikely. Therefore, the judge decided to defer the bail decision and requested a psychiatric evaluation for Akshay. Throughout this time, Christy continued to suffer. Her father was scheduled to return from Australia in a week, and she convinced her family not to inform him about what had happened so that he could continue working without worry. Initially, she was afraid not only to travel in public transportation but even to sleep in her own room. Whenever she heard any sound at night, she immediately asked her family to check what it was. Her greatest fear was that Akshay would be released and would attack her family or fixate on another innocent girl. By early November, life began to slowly improve. Chand was scheduled to appear in court on Wednesday, November 9th, and in 2 months, Christy and her family would be living in Australia. The relocation, which was initially meant to mark the beginning of an exciting new chapter in their lives, now became an urgent necessity. On the morning of November 7th, Tracy got up at 6:30 and began preparing for her workday. She let the dogs out, made breakfast, and took a shower. As she was getting dressed, she heard a knock on the door. It was still early, around 7 a.m., But Tracy wasn't surprised by the knock. Christy loved shopping online, and her orders were usually delivered in the morning. While Christy was still asleep, getting some rest before her late shift at work, Tracy went to answer the door herself. There was a young man standing on the porch. Tracy didn't recognize him immediately, but then she realized it was Akshay Chanda. He was holding a knife. Tracy felt fear grip her as Chanda forced his way into her home. She screamed as loudly as she could, hoping that Christy would hear and understand that something terrible was happening and have time to escape. Or maybe the neighbors would hear and come to their aid. Still threatening Tracy with the knife, Chanda asked who else was in the house. Tracy lied and said her husband was home. That was not true. He had already returned to Australia. He had wanted to leave work, but the police convinced him that his family would be safe. But somehow Chanda seemed to know this, which made Tracy suspect he had been watching them for some time. Suddenly, Christy appeared on the stairs near Tracy and Chanda. Barefoot and in her sleepwear, she was awakened by her mother's scream and went upstairs to find out what was happening. When she saw Chanda, Christy screamed. Frozen with fear, she stood at the top of the stairs, unable to move. Chanda continued to direct the knife at Tracy, slowly advancing toward Christy. Then he kicked her in the chest, causing her to tumble down the stairs. Christy got up, ran down the steps, but slipped in her haste and fell again. She then got up and ran through her grandmother's room and into the backyard. Chanda chased after her. Meanwhile, Tracy called the police. Given what Chanda had done previously, she thought he might be trying to scare Christy again. She was confident that Christy would be able to lock herself in her grandmother's room, and Chanda wouldn't be able to reach her. The police were aware of the situation. They would be there within a few minutes and arrest Chanda. Tracy dialed emergency services. But before she could provide her address, she heard a frantic scream. It was Christy. Tracy dropped the phone and ran downstairs. Christy lay on the porch in the backyard, with a pool of blood spreading beneath her. Chanda stood nearby. Tracy rushed to her daughter and embraced her. She couldn't see any wounds, but Christy couldn't move. It seemed difficult for her to breathe. Tracy repeatedly told her daughter that she loved her and begged her to hold on because help was on the way. It seemed to Tracy that Christy was trying to say something to her. Looking into her eyes, Tracy saw that life had just left them. Christy was gone. Chanda just stood there. When Tracy looked at him, she saw that he still held the knife. The blade was bent at a 90-degree angle. Chanda himself was covered in blood. Showing no concern about what might happen to her next, Tracy screamed that he had killed Christy. With a completely emotionless voice, he replied, "I'm glad." The police arrived less than 10 minutes after the attack began. Chanda was still in the backyard, listening to music on an iPad. The broken knife lay on the ground. An officer asked what he was doing there. Chanda replied, "Retribution." Another officer noticed that Chanda's hands were trembling and asked why. He responded, "It's not easy to kill someone, is it?" Chanda was arrested and taken to the police station. Tracy had the difficult task of informing Heather and Brian about what had just happened to Christy. The Marceau family had been convinced that something like this would happen ever since Chanda was released on bail a month earlier. Initially, the judge denied his release, citing the need for further information about the case and the defendant's health condition. However, since he qualified for bail under the law, his lawyer quickly filed 2 applications for release. Chanda wrote a letter to the new judge, David McNaughton, expressing remorse for the attack on Christy. He stated that he deeply regretted what he had put the girl through and, given the opportunity, he would apologize to her and her family. Christy also wrote a letter to the judge, pleading not to release Akshay. She believed that since he had nothing to lose, he would attempt to attack her again. On October 5th, the judge granted Chanda bail, despite reading Christy's letter and being aware that the police also believed it was right to keep him behind bars. Chanda was allowed to return to his home, which was located just 350 meters away from Christy's house. in a straight line. The police were extremely disappointed but assured the Marceau family that they would protect them. Officers promised to check on Chanda at various times of the day, making sure he was at home. All the officers patrolling the area were informed about the case. Overall, the police visited Chanda 23 times in the 32 days he was free, and each time he was at home. Despite the police assurances, Christie's fears grew. And after 32 days, he showed up at her doorstep with a knife. Forensic experts investigating the scene of her death found the knife Chanda used to stab her 10 to 15 times before it bent 90 degrees and became useless. He attacked her from behind, delivering a powerful blow to the back of her head. She fell to the floor, where Chanda continued to strike her on the back. One wound was so severe that Christie almost felt nothing afterwards. In the police station, Chanda was surprisingly calm and immediately confessed to everything. Despite suddenly releasing Christie on one occasion, he had never let go of his desire for revenge, and in prison, he started plotting her murder. Knowing that he needed to escape from prison to carry out his plan, he feigned remorse by writing a sympathetic letter to the judge. While free, he didn't waste any time and waited, knowing that Christie and her family would be protected by the police. Although the judge believed that Chanda's family would keep an eye on him throughout the day, his mother worked long hours, and his sister was too young for such a role. She was scared of him herself. All his mother could do was keep kitchen knives away from him, but Chanda knew what she had in mind and hid one of them. On November 7th, he woke up at 6:30, knowing that the day had come. In 2 days, he was scheduled to appear in court, and Christie probably believed that she was safe. The investigators were confident that Akshay would be found guilty on all charges, since he had confessed to everything. However, they were surprised when he decided to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. Several experts, including one hired by his defense and 2 from the prosecution, evaluated him. Akshay told them that he had been hearing a persistent female voice for some time, especially in the mornings. He claimed that the voice ordered him to kill Christie and wished for her mother's death. Although initially Akshay could resist the voice's influence, he eventually succumbed to it. After consultations with psychiatrists and starting medication, he didn't express remorse for the murder but acknowledged that he would have to live with the knowledge of what he had done. It was incredibly difficult for Christie's parents to come to terms with the medical assessment. Tracy, in particular, struggled. She regretted opening the door to the killer and couldn't forget the last moments of Christie's life. "All I see, all I will ever see, is my daughter lying on my lap, gasping for air, covered in blood, dying for some senseless reason. He just stood there and watched. He didn't even attempt to escape. What kind of person does that?" She demanded punishment for Akshay, but the psychiatrist explained to her that Akshay's symptoms, previously attributed to depression, could now be explained by schizophrenia. Moreover, when depression is treated with medication, symptoms of schizophrenia can become more pronounced. During the first attack, the illness was in its early stage, and he managed to understand that harming the girl would be wrong, so he let her go. However, during the second incident, when he came for her, he was aware of what he was doing, but his illness prevented him from understanding that it was morally unacceptable. Akshay couldn't be tried for murder, but he was found guilty of kidnapping and attempted sexual assault. However, he would still serve his punishment in a psychiatric facility. He would only be released if he ceased to pose a danger to society, but his chances of recovery were extremely slim. The Marceau family relocated to Adelaide, Australia, but they didn't allow Christie's murder to become just another crime statistic. If Akshay had not been released on bail after the first crime, Christie would have moved to Australia and lived happily. Therefore, they started a campaign to change the bail laws. Thanks in part to their efforts, since 2013, defendants are required to prove that they are not a threat to society, instead of the police having to prove the opposite as it was before. In July 2019, an unprecedented scandal erupted in Romania, demonstrating how the police respond to calls to the emergency service. The call to number 112 was received on July 25th at 11:05. The caller, a 15-year-old schoolgirl named Alexandra Masisanu, struggling to speak, told the operator that she had been kidnapped, beaten, assaulted, and was being held against her will in some house.
Alo?
Bună ziua!
Bună ziua!
Vreau și în legătură cu poliția.
Da. Ce s-a întâmplat?
Doamnă,
Nu vă numiți.
sunt domnișoara, am 15 ani și ieri am fost sechestrată de către un domn.
Cum te cheamă?
She didn't know where she was, but only knew that she was in the city of Caracal. Before the call was interrupted, the operator sarcastically asked how they would find her if she didn't tell them her location.
Mă cheamă Alexandra, vă rog, veniți repede, nu știu unde sunt.
Cum adică nu știi unde ești? În ce localitate te afli?
În Caracal, m-a dus în Caracal, dar nu știu unde exact.
Păi dă-mi un punct de reper unde te afli în Caracal. Cum crezi că te găsim?
Fortunately, Alexandra called again at 11:06, and the operator once again tried to ascertain her location. The girl managed to provide important details. For example, she had seen a dam before the kidnapper blindfolded her eyes. He had a gray car, and she was being held in a very old,
Dilapidated house near a gas station. There was a lot of grass and bushes in the yard, as well as 2 dogs. She even mentioned a name and an address that she read from a business card she found and explained that she was calling from the kidnapper's phone. The operator relayed the situation to a police officer who continued to communicate with the girl. He told her to stay where she was because they were sending a team. Alexandra tried to provide more description of the kidnapper's car in the yard, but the police officer wasn't listening anymore. The schoolgirl called again at 11:12 and asked if they had sent anyone to help her. Another police officer replied irritably that the team had already been dispatched but couldn't reach her in 2 minutes. Alexandra begged the police officer to stay on the line with her because she was terrified, but he responded that they had other calls to attend to. "The team will arrive in 2 or 3 minutes, what the hell?" he added. The girl reluctantly agreed. Although the emergency services personnel knew that the kidnapper was supposed to return any minute, they inexplicably called Alexandra 9 more times, but no one answered. Not surprisingly, even if the girl had initially tried to discreetly place the phone back, the kidnapper now knew for certain that she had called the police. 12 hours after Alexandra's call, the police finally brought her father to the station, allowed him to listen to the emergency call, and asked if he recognized his daughter's voice. When the man confirmed that it was her voice, they believed it was not a prank, and only then did they begin their investigation. Unfortunately, the name on the business card Alexandra found belonged to a man who had no connection to the case, and the specialized telecommunications service couldn't trace the origin of the call. Technicians were able to provide the officers with a very wide search radius and 3 possible locations for the girl, but none of the specified locations were correct. At that point, the police turned to surveillance camera recordings to identify a vehicle involved in a similar case. Once they identified the driver, they surrounded his house. Despite not being legally required, the police applied for a warrant and simply waited. They received the warrant at 6 in the morning on July 26th, a staggering 19 hours after Alexandra's call. Only then did they knock on the suspect's house gate. Of course, they were late. Inside the house, they found Alexandra's clothes and jewelry in the car, the girl's earring, and in the yard, a metallic barrel with ashes and human remains. The man stated that he doesn't know any Alexandru Masishano, and the ashes in the barrel remained after the fire he lit to defend himself from persistent mosquitoes. However, after a thorough examination of the barrel's contents, investigators found 6 teeth. The results of the laboratory analysis left no room for doubt. The teeth belonged to Alexandra. The police arrested the homeowner, 66-year-old Gerga Dinka, a retired mechanic. Neighbors knew Georga as an aggressive and inhumane person. So inhumane that he had a special code for his rare visitors. 3 knocks on the door. He suffered from antisocial personality disorder, had been admitted to a mental institution 5 times, and his troubled childhood could have been a possible reason for his condition. Georga's father worked as a butcher, engaging in illegal meat trade, often killing and butchering animals in front of his son, forcing the boy to assist. This soon became routine, and Georga himself was already killing stray animals for his twisted pleasure. His father was a heavy drinker and frequently beat the boy, using belts, brooms, and even the hose from the washing machine multiple times a day.
He also tied his son up with a wire to prevent him from going outside to play with other kids. Interestingly, later on, Gheorghe started treating his own victims the same way. Not surprisingly, the boy performed poorly in school. However, when he joined the army, it seemed like his life was getting on track, and he found his place, until he assaulted another soldier who turned out to be the son of a defense ministry official. Expelled from the army, Gheorghe returned home and got a job as a general laborer at a hospital. He worked there for 8 years before attempting to find work on construction sites in Italy. Once again, things didn't work out, as he was fired after brutally beating an Albanian worker. After attacking a young woman, he was deported from the country. Upon returning to Romania, he worked as a mechanic, drove taxis, and also collected and sold scrap metal. Despite his inhumane behavior and reclusiveness, he managed to start a family and became the father of 4 children. His wife, tired of his constant abuse, lived and worked in Italy. Sources close to Gheorghe say that when his wife came to Romania for the last time, he severely beat her. All 4 children left their father's house. 3 sons chose to live with their mother, while the daughter settled in Timisoara. After George's arrest, she insisted that she had no contact with her father, whom she considered mentally unstable. So, as it appears, Gheorghe Dinka was a recluse, living in isolation, and his behavioral issues couldn't resolve on their own. Another shocking piece of news shocked the public. Gheorghe confessed to the murder of the second girl, whom he abducted in April, 2 months prior to Alexandra's kidnapping. The second victim of the man was an 18-year-old named Luisa Melencu. Until the age of 12, Luisa lived in Italy with her mother, Monica Melencu, who worked there and engaged in vegetable cultivation. However, in search of a better life and income, Monica moved to the United Kingdom, while Luisa chose to finish school in her homeland and lived with her grandparents. She dedicated a lot of time to her studies and was determined to get an excellent education to find a job with a decent salary to support her family. But she relied on her mother's support for the time being. On April 14th, her mother sent her money for sports shoes. Luisa went to an ATM in Caracal, but for some reason, she couldn't withdraw money. She called her grandfather to let him know she was on her way home and headed to the bus stop. However, since it was Sunday and public transportation was scarce, especially in rural areas where locals often complained about its unreliability even on weekdays, Luisa decided to hitchhike. Unfortunately, Gheorghe Dinka was passing by. He agreed to give her a ride. Luisa struck up a conversation and told him about her failed attempt to get money from the ATM. Upon hearing this, Gheorghe offered her 30 lei, approximately $7, for intimate services. She refused, after which Gheorghe decided to take what he wanted by force. Meanwhile, Luisa's grandfather began to worry because he knew his granddaughter should have been home by now. He called her mobile phone, but she didn't answer. Recognizing this behavior as entirely out of character, he rushed to the police station to report her disappearance. However, the officers dismissed his concerns, attributing Luisa's absence to a potential romantic involvement. Left with no choice, Luisa's family started searching for her themselves, and her classmates spread information about her disappearance on social media. The next day, an unidentified man called Luisa's grandfather, assuring him that Luisa was fine but didn't want to talk to him. He added that they were planning to go to Switzerland together. Not believing a word of the stranger's claim, the grandfather made multiple attempts to contact the police but received no assistance. Luisa's mother, Monica, traveled from the UK, where she had been living and working, and had somewhat better luck with the police. Only on the 4th day did the police begin an investigation which seemed more like mockery of the relatives. Luisa's grandfather was subjected to a polygraph test because they suspected him of withholding information. Finally, on May 30th, the case was handed over to the Directorate for Investigating Organized Crime and Terrorism, DICOT, which announced the opening of a criminal case on June 6th. They decided to investigate Luisa's disappearance as a human trafficking case, as they saw signs that she might have been recruited against her will for sexual exploitation. DICOT continued their investigation when news broke about the disappearance of another girl, Alexandra Masishanu. A 15-year-old teenager from Dobrosloveni was a student in the 10th grade at one of the top schools in Caracal. On July 24th, Alexandra left her home at 10 o'clock in the morning to meet a friend from Caracal. No one else saw her after that. The girl's parents quickly turned to the police, but the officers did not take their concerns seriously, stating that she was old enough to go out with friends and lose track of time. They advised them to wait. When the truth about the 2 murders came to light, the The criminal inaction and negligence of officials and law enforcement personnel triggered a massive political crisis in the country. Many government bodies tried to demonstrate their activity, showing that they were doing their job, but it did not help them. The Minister of the Interior, the head of the criminal police, the director of the rescue service, the police leadership, and the prosecution in Caracal were all dismissed. The Prime Minister dismissed the Minister of Education, who cynically remarked that young girls should think twice before getting into strangers' cars, as if she were unaware of the problems with public transportation in the country and the fact that hitchhiking is sometimes the only way to travel in small towns. The police claimed that the Special Telecommunications Service employees could not provide more precise information about the origins of the calls, leading to their search efforts being focused in the wrong places. However, the police were also criticized for their slow and chaotic response. Frustrated, the grandfather of Louisa labeled them as criminals being paid by the government to not do their job. At the same time, questions arose about the remains of the murdered girls. Here is where the most significant mystery of this story begins. Gheorghe stated that he burned the bodies. He scattered fragments of Louisa's bones in the forest and disposed of her clothes. However, he did not have time to do the same with Alexandra's clothes and body. Investigators reconstructed the crime scenes. Gheorghe was asked to guide the investigators step by step to all the places he had been on the days of the deaths of Louisa and Alexandra. At this point, he started to contradict himself in his statements, allegedly struggling to remember what he did at the time. According to criminologists, Gheorghe intentionally led them on a wild goose chase. Although he confessed to the 2 murders he was asked about, when he was requested to repeat his actions during the crimes and show where he left the remains, he panicked. This might be because he probably had a secret location where he hid all his victims. As there were likely more than 2 bodies in that hidden place, he led the investigators on a wild goose chase, pretending to be confused, not understanding and not remembering anything. Although fragments of bones were found in the forest, experts believed that the bodies were either in the Danube or the Olt River. In November 2019, while in prison, Gheorghe began to write a confession detailing what he had done to Louisa and Alexandra. He started his account with the incident on April 14th, when he stopped his car as Louise was hitchhiking on the road. He agreed to give her a ride and engaged in conversation with her during the journey. He realized that he was becoming sexually aroused. His thoughts were consumed by nothing else but fulfilling his own desires. The man offered the girl 30 Romanian lei, about $7, for intimate services. When she declined, he struck her in the face and bound her with a belt. Interestingly, Gheorghe also blindfolded her so that the victim wouldn't know the way to his house. Does this imply that he intended to release her alive? After parking the car at his house, the man noticed his 36-year-old neighbor, Stefan Repeziano, in the yard. Stefan occasionally helped Gheorghe clean up the yard. Seeing a beautiful young girl in the car, Stefan asked who she was. With no other option, Gheorghe said that he brought her for intimate services, and the neighbor asked to join him. Gheorghe agreed. The men subjected Louise to humiliation and continued to torment her for 4 days. On the morning of the 4th day, Gheorghe lost his temper when the girl tried to resist him for the last time. He violently beat her and left her in a pool of blood on the bed, briefly stepping out to feed otters. When he returned, it was already too late to help the girl. The man didn't panic. He placed her in a metallic barrel and set it on fire, covering it with plastic and cardboard. Then, he went to sleep. When he woke up, he collected the ashes and fragments of bones and scattered them along the border of the nearby forest. Gheorghe's account of what happened to Alexandra was even more sinister. On July 24th, 2 months after Louisa's murder, he noticed the same girl hitchhiking on the road again. Even though he was driving in the opposite direction, he turned the car around and offered her a ride. The story repeated itself. He offered Alexandra 50 lei for intimate services, and upon her refusal, he abducted her. He brought the bound girl to his home, immediately tying her to the bed and subjecting her to violence. The next day at 6 in the morning, Gheorghe was drinking coffee while his victim lay tied to the bed. The girl complained of a terrible headache and said she needed a painkiller. Gheorghe suggested going to buy some medication. Before leaving, he additionally tied her with ropes, wires, and a chain. In addition to the medication, he bought a prepaid card to call Alexandra's mother. Inserting it into the girl's mobile phone, he called her mother and claimed to be Alexandra's boyfriend, assuring her that everything was fine. Then he discarded the phone. The phone was later found, and some children played with it. The man returned home around noon.
He saw that Alexandra had freed herself and was wandering around the house with his mobile phone. He struck her several times, causing her to fall and hit her head on the concrete floor, resulting in her death. The man wrapped the body in bedsheets, placed some wooden planks and chips, and a 2-liter bottle of Vaseline in a barrel and set it on fire. On top, he threw a thick cardboard. He also threw his mobile phone there. Then he went to sleep. He woke up early in the morning to the barking of dogs, as police were banging on his door. Despite the man's confession and the results of the DNA analysis, the families of Alexandra and Luisa refused to believe that Gheorghe killed the girls. And the matter was not only in the reluctance of the relatives to believe that they are no longer alive. In fact, there was reason to suspect Gheorghe of human trafficking and that the girls weren't killed but were sold for exploitation. First of all, in favor of this version is the fact that human trafficking is a very common phenomenon in Romania. Additionally, in 2022, Gheorghe recanted his confession. He confirmed that he kidnapped and mistreated Alexandra and Luisa, but then handed them over to a local criminal boss who sent the girls to a brothel in Turkey. The police allegedly protect this boss, so they tortured Gheorghe and forced him to take the blame for the murder, and they planted Alexandra's teeth themselves. The man's story seems far-fetched if it weren't for some facts. It's unclear why George didn't immediately try to dispose of Alexandra's body, knowing that she had called the police from his phone. Instead of that, he slowly cremated her body for a long 8 hours. Moreover, the burning of an entire human body should produce a very unpleasant smell and smoke. However, the man's neighbors didn't notice any smoke, smell, or anything unusual. The way Gheorghe behaved during the abductions shows that he knew step by step how to act. He knew how to select victims of a specific appearance, and the act of abduction itself seemed standardized. The series of potential crimes was only interrupted when Alexandra pulled him out of this familiar routine by calling the police. Furthermore, investigators speculated that Gheorghe might have had accomplices. The point is, right after the girls' disappearances, unknown individuals called both families several times, assuring them that the girls were all right. At least 2 of these calls were made by Gheorghe, but Alexandra's mother and Luisa's grandfather are convinced that 2 people were calling them. This argument that Gheorghe might have had accomplices prompted not only Romanian police, but also the FBI, Eurojust, and Italy's main anti-mafia agency to get involved in the investigation. Additionally, it seemed to the relatives that the prosecution intentionally prolonged the case. In particular, the prosecutor received video material that indicated Gheorghe's car was connected to Luisa's abduction, but the prosecutor never summoned him for questioning or ordered a search of his car or home. After Alexandra's disappearance until July 27th, he didn't share the surveillance camera footage, which captured Gheorghe's car. Even then, he only showed them a single frame from the video where the car's license plate wasn't visible. Also, on July 27th, after searching the man's house, another accuser not only claimed that Alexandra was killed on that night, but also that strangulation was the cause of her death. However, how could he know this without the victim's body? Gheorghe hadn't made a confession yet. And finally, the most intriguing argument in favor of the possibility that the man might have been involved in human trafficking is that his daughter, Daniela Dinky, assured investigators and the media that she wanted nothing to do with her father and didn't communicate with him. But it turned out to be a lie. She did communicate with her father, and she has a criminal record herself. A few years ago, she was accused of connections to human trafficking networks. Following this, another revelation came in the story. Gheorghe Dinka's son, Dan, was once involved in a group assault and escaped punishment only due to his father's intervention. Allegedly, Gheorghe had connections within the police and the prosecutor's office. The victim was persuaded to withdraw her statement and the case was kept confidential. Equally important in this case is the question of whether Gheorghe's list of victims could be longer. 2 girls were abducted under similar circumstances when trying to hitchhike, and they resembled each other in appearance. This points to a characteristic modus operandi of the criminal, relying on chance and showing an interest in a specific type of appearance. The man's inclination to commit crimes might partly be explained by his suffering from antisocial personality disorder. This condition is characterized by a constant pursuit of pleasure and satisfaction, as well as a lack of empathy, respect for the feelings, needs, or suffering of others, and a lack of remorse after offending or causing harm to another person. Some individuals suffering from this condition cannot form close relationships and use dominance and intimidation to control others. In this context, all the elements of the puzzle come together to form a coherent picture.
But what's surprising is Georga's age, 66 years old. Criminals with a similar diagnosis usually evolve into violent killers during their youth. This disorder remains with a person throughout their life and doesn't appear and then diminish like other mental disorders. In other words, it's rare for a man to suddenly kill 2 girls with a 2-month gap at the age of 66.
Georga most likely committed other heinous crimes in the past. It's unlikely that Alexandra and Louise were his only victims. Very unlikely. Georga was charged with human trafficking, trafficking of minors, 2 cases of assault, 2 murders, and 2 cases of desecration of bodies. But he wasn't planning on surrendering so easily. Dubbed the Caracal Monster, he attempted to sue Romania in the European Court of Human Rights, pointing to a lack of evidence and claiming that he was treated unfairly during his arrest. He fought for a long time, but ultimately lost. On September 23rd, the 69-year-old Georga was sentenced to the maximum possible punishment, 30 years of imprisonment. The thing is, for all the charges brought against him, he should have received 108 years in prison. But for individuals over the age of 65, the maximum punishment is considered to be 30 years. He is also obligated to pay compensation of 700,000 euros to the victim's relatives. The neighbor of the man, Stefan Repeziano, was sentenced to 7 years in prison for his involvement in the violence. In March 2023, Georga once again caught the public's attention by declaring that he had repented and found God. He stated that he was able to forget and leave behind the entire ordeal. In contrast to him, the victims' relatives will never be able to forget what happened. In 2016, a suburban train was moving along its usual route towards Berlin when suddenly one of the passengers felt unwell. Unfortunately, it was not possible to save him, and the 37-year-old man passed away due to heart failure. Despite the sorrowful nature of his death, he died of natural causes. However, his departure from life triggered a chain of events that led to the resolution of a case that had remained a mystery for 23 years. The German town of Bad Belzig, which was simply known as Belzig until 2010, is located 70 kilometers southwest of Berlin. Today, it is home to 11,000 people. Bad Belzig is considered a historic town because it houses the medieval fortress of Eisenhardt Castle, Burg Eisenhardt, first mentioned in a document from the year 997, issued by Emperor Otto III, which is quite impressive. Apart from the castle, one of the main attractions of the town is the thermal complex called Steintherm, where families and groups of friends often gather on weekends for leisure and relaxation. Overall, Bad Belzig appears to be an excellent town for family living. Among the families who settled in the town was the family of Andrea Lohagen. Andrea, her sister, as well as their parents Rosemarie and Freddie, lived on the outskirts of the city in a new residential complex. Andrea was born on January 6, 1977, and by 1993 had grown into an attractive 16-year-old girl. Andrea was in the 11th grade and eagerly awaited finishing school. As one of the top students in her class, she felt confident about her future studies at the university. She was a responsible, intelligent, serious, well-read girl, yet sociable and friendly. Everyone who knew her sincerely loved her. On Thursday, October 7, 1993, there were only 2 school days left before the holidays. Naturally, Andrea was looking forward to the upcoming vacation, shopping, parties, and meetings with friends. On that day, her parents decided to spoil their daughter and took her to a large shopping center where they bought Andrea a pair of platform shoes and Levi's jeans she had been eyeing for a while. At 6 o'clock in the evening, when they returned home, Andrea, as usual, turned on the music cassette of her favorite band, Alphaville, and began selecting what to wear with her new items. Of course, she was in high spirits. Indeed, like any teenager, she couldn't wait to show off her new outfit to her friends that same evening. And Andrea knew the ideal place to reach as large an audience as possible for this. After dinner, around 8 o'clock in the evening, Andrea called her friend to arrange a walk, but she was already in Potsdam. Pogo was the name of the local club where teenagers like to gather. As it often happens with clubs in small towns, it was conveniently located equidistant from the homes of local families, and Andrea and her friends were regular visitors. Pogo was a 15-minute walk from her home, and considering the short distance, the girl often walked instead of waiting for the bus. She hadn't learned to drive a car yet. Moreover, in a small town, she felt safe walking alone in the evening, and her parents were not afraid to let her go out alone. Besides, in the evening,
The likelihood of not meeting anyone on the way was higher than encountering someone unfriendly. So, on October 7th, as always, Andrea decided to walk, first asking her parents for permission to leave for a few hours. They agreed, asking her to return no later than 10 o'clock. Andrea agreed without argument and left home at 8 o'clock in the evening. That evening, as always when their daughter left home, her parents stayed awake, expecting Andrea. But when the clock struck 10 in the evening, the girl hadn't returned home. At first, the parents thought she was caught up socializing with friends and either forgot about the time or didn't manage to leave the club on time. They waited a little longer, constantly peeking out the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of their daughter. An hour passed, then a second, but it grew later, and Rosemary and Freddie became increasingly worried. What troubled them particularly was that Andrea was one of the best students in her class, which meant she knew she had to go to school the next day. Therefore, it seemed unlikely for her to intentionally stay out late. It was completely out of character for her because she was a very responsible girl who always came home on time and listened to her parents. Complicating matters was the fact that in 1993, teenagers didn't have mobile phones. Andrea couldn't write or call her parents if she was delayed, and they couldn't find out her whereabouts. By 12:30, unable to contain their worry, the parents began calling her friends, hoping that perhaps she stayed the night at one of their places, as they were closer. But of course, that wasn't the case. No one knew where she was. At 1 o'clock in the morning, driven mad by worry, her father Freddie decided to look for her himself. He drove several times along the road she should have taken to the club, went through other, more remote streets, but he couldn't find his daughter. Shortly before 4 o'clock in the morning, he went to the police station and reported his daughter missing. He probably hoped that the police would act immediately because several hours had passed since she was supposed to return home, but he was mistaken. Officers believed it was too early to take any action. Although this was extremely upsetting and disappointing for the girl's parents, those were the rules. The police often receive reports of missing persons, especially when it involves a teenager, and they prefer to wait a day before taking action because teenagers usually return on their own the next morning. On the other hand, how many reports of missing teenagers could the police get in the town of 11,000 people? Besides, Andrea wasn't a problematic teenager. She had no reason to run away, no conflicts at home or with friends. Andrea was a happy girl who had just returned from shopping. The holidays were near, and she was allowed to hang out and enjoy her youth with friends. Her parents were convinced that Andrea wouldn't have run away, but the fact remained. For Rosemary and Freddie, this must have been a real nightmare. Sitting at home, unable to rest, fearing for their daughter's life, constantly imagining scenarios of what might have happened to her, knowing that nobody was even looking for her. On the following day, January 8th, Andrea's mother, Rosemary, also attempted to search for her daughter independently. It's understandable that waiting for the police to take action might have been a real torment. She walked through the town center and along the path Andrea was supposed to take. About 100 meters from the Pogo Club, she noticed a wooded area. Interestingly, this plot belonged to the grandfather of Andrea's former boyfriend, a boy a little older than her, from whom she had parted ways just a few weeks before her disappearance. While exploring this area, the girl's mother stumbled upon a hut where she found a mattress and a hand towel lying around. At that moment, surrounded by trees and hearing only the barking of dogs, she suddenly felt very uncomfortable, almost physically sensing that something was amiss. Suspicion crept into her mind that Andrea's former boyfriend might have something to do with her disappearance, and she would continue to believe this for a long time. Convinced that detectives should inspect this area, she reported it to the police, but once again, they did nothing. They explained that they didn't see any reason or concrete evidence to investigate this territory. It was unclear where the evidence could have come from if they hadn't started their work yet. Perhaps they should have looked for clues in the hut. Nevertheless, they clarified to Rosemary that they didn't have a warrant, meaning they couldn't legally go there. Only a week after the teenager's disappearance did the police finally begin their work. Law enforcement checked hospitals and transportation, leaving Bag Belzig, the place where Andrea could have departed from. Helicopters flew over the forests of the town for several days, while ground search teams, including dog handlers, scoured the area. Dog handlers searched the route between the girl's home and Pogo and examined the surrounding areas. To precisely establish Andrea's last actions, detectives interviewed all possible witnesses, everyone present at Pogo on that evening. However, it proved quite challenging. as the police had waited for an entire week and teenagers frequented Pogo every day. They were now confused about the specific day and couldn't accurately confirm if they had seen Andrea at the club on October 7th. Fortunately, after speaking with 21-year-old Yvonne Eshkin, a club employee, they were able to confirm that Andrea was there on the 7th. Yvonne remembered seeing Andrea standing outside the club. While she couldn't recall the exact time, it was definitely before 10 p.m. because Pogo closes at 10 p.m. Other witnesses remembered seeing Andrea walking along a dark road towards the club. Another witness reported seeing her talking to two boys. The police questioned 13-year-old Robin and 14-year-old David, who confirmed exchanging a few words with Andrea as she was returning from the club, after which she went home while the boys went in the opposite direction. The police began to suspect that Andrea might have taken an isolated narrow path that would have been plunged into complete darkness at that late hour. The locals referred to this path as the Lover's Path, located between the homes of two families, which would have allowed the girl to reach home much faster than the main road. However, the police could never confirm whether she indeed took the Lover's Path because neither the canine units nor the forensic experts found any evidence supporting this theory. Nonetheless, this secret path was often used by teenagers returning from the club. To attract more attention to the case, Andrea's photo was shown on television, and a reward of 10,000 marks was offered for information that could help find her. The police asked anyone who could assist them in bringing the girl back home safely to contact them. They received over 250 reports stating that Andrea Lohagen had been seen in various countries around the world: Turkey, Greece, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and Spain. However, despite the police's efforts to investigate each lead, none of them led to any breakthroughs. Eventually, the police admitted defeat as they had nothing to work with, and the investigation came to a standstill. The case remained unsolved, and Andrea Lohagen was no longer sought after by anyone other than her family. 7 years later, on July 9, 2000, a local resident was enjoying her morning coffee on a beautiful day when she saw Josie, her landlord's dog, joyfully playing with something resembling a soccer ball. However, upon closer inspection, the woman realized that it wasn't a ball but a human skull. She hurriedly called the police. Soon, Frank Friedrich, the woman's landlord, arrived. Unexpectedly, he claimed that he had already seen the skull, took it from the dog, and hid it before leaving to celebrate his parents' birthday. Upon returning home to address the matter, the police were already there. The man explained his peculiar behavior by stating that he knew that during World War II, prisoners of war were held in that area, so he assumed the skull was quite old. Therefore, he hid it, intending to deal with it later. When the police inspected the area where the skull, presumably that of Andrea, was found by the dog, it turned out to be the very same location warned about by Andrea's mother, just 10 meters behind the Lover's Path and 100 meters from Pogo. Inside a long-abandoned cabin, behind a weathered door simply leaning against the wall, the police found the rest of the skeleton. Thus, if the killer attempted to hide the body, they hadn't put in much effort. Surprisingly, despite the police searching this location with sniffer dogs in 1993, nobody noticed or smelled anything. Journalists, reporters, the landlord's dogs, construction workers, and local residents had visited the site, all departing with the same outcome. Naturally, the locals, convinced the remains belonged to Andrea, were furious at how the police handled the investigation. The police defended their actions, stating they had investigated the area only a week after the girl's disappearance. Supposedly, they had acted very promptly since the police are obligated to search for a missing person, only if there are suspicions of a crime or several weeks after the disappearance. Regardless, the remains were sent to a laboratory, confirming they indeed belonged to Andrea. DNA comparison was unnecessary as the victim's dental records matched the teeth in the skull. Although the girl's remains were found, the forensic expert couldn't determine how she was killed or what happened before her death, as only the skeleton remained. However, he noted a head injury on the skull. Notably, Andrea was found not where the murder occurred. Her clothing wasn't found in the cabin. Even her watch and favorite ring were missing. To this day, it remains unknown whether this implies the victim was assaulted, causing her clothes to be removed, or if they were taken to conceal evidence.
If the latter is true, the perpetrator's actions seem senseless because the body wasn't even hidden. With the discovery of the remains, the case was reopened, but it was now a murder investigation for Andrea Lohagen. At this point, Both the police and the townspeople questioned what the motive for the murder could have been. They were especially troubled by the fact that the lover's path, near where the body was found, was only known to a limited number of locals, suggesting the killer lived in Bad Belzig and possibly was still among them. However, despite this breakthrough and a reward of 5,000 euros for any information, the police still lacked substantial leads, leaving the case unsolved for many years. Everything changed in the summer of 2016 when an unknown woman called the police, claiming she precisely knew who killed Andrea Lohagen, her friend, 37-year-old David. He was one of the two boys who had met Andrea on her way from Pogo. At the time of Andrea's disappearance, David was 14 years old. As an adult, David was a loner who enjoyed solitude, struggled to hold a job due to alcohol and substance abuse issues, and this lifestyle undoubtedly led to health problems. The woman who called the police explained that the reason she decided to share this information was that David had died in the same year, 2016. He was on a train to Berlin when he suddenly fell ill and passed away due to natural causes. It is unknown how long this woman had been holding on to this information. David left no other confessions. The only evidence hinting at his guilty conscience was a dark post on a social media platform. In the photo, a man wearing a shirt with the inscription "Wanted" is seen holding a small child. Underneath the image, he wrote, "You can do the right thing 1,000 times, but make one mistake, and you're worthless." The police tried to learn from David's mother what she knew about the matter, perhaps if her son had confessed to her about the crime. However, she was reluctant to speak with the officers. After all, she still lived in the same town where Andrea went missing, and where her family resided. Eventually, she admitted that her son had told her they and a friend had planned to rob Andrea, but everything went wrong, and Andrea was killed. That was all she knew. The woman who called the police added that at the time of David's murder, he wasn't alone. He was with his then 13-year-old friend, Robin. In 2016, 36-year-old Robin lived in Tyrol, Austria, with his wife and 2 children, worked on a dairy farm, was very quiet, friendly, and spent evenings at home. He was so secretive that his colleagues only learned about his wedding after he decided to change his surname following the marriage. Robin was questioned on October 27, 2016, but since he was 13 years old at the time of the crime, he was questioned only as a witness, not a suspect. Law enforcement couldn't imprison him, even if he confessed to the crime, as he was below the age of criminal responsibility at 13.
Of course, this doesn't seem right. If you understand how to take someone's life, you should be punished in some way. During the conversation, Robin didn't deny David's involvement in the crime, but asked for the opportunity to discuss his own participation after speaking with his family. He was allowed to go home and was given a new date to return to the station for further questioning. However,
police soon realized that Robin's desire to talk to his family wasn't the real reason for refusing to speak with them. It was merely an excuse to leave the station. Indeed, just a few hours after returning home, he left again. But before that, he left a farewell note for his wife. He put on hiking boots, got into the car, and headed towards Pendling Mountain, located approximately 15 kilometers from his home. There, he climbed the mountain and jumped from it. 4 days later, on November 4th, his body was found by a hunter. In the note to his wife, he didn't explain anything, just bid farewell. The police chief later mentioned that when the detectives spoke with Robin, they explained to him that he wouldn't face any problems, no prison sentence. They just wanted to know why he did it. They wanted Andrea's parents to get answers to the questions that had tormented them for so many years. But Robin decided otherwise. It was undoubtedly difficult for Andrea's parents to come to terms with his departure. With his departure, their last chance to find out the motive behind the murder disappeared. What happened just before Andrea's death and how exactly she died. Why they removed her clothes and how long the girl remained alive. Also, where exactly everything happened. However, it's very interesting that the plot where the cabin was located belonged not only to Andrea's former boyfriend, but also to one of the boys' grandfathers. This is because Andrea's ex-boyfriend and Robin were cousins. David and Robin were troublesome teenagers well known throughout the town. They were often seen smoking or drinking alcohol. Soon they embarked on a series of burglaries, after which they served time in juvenile detention. So, it couldn't be said that they were kids whom no one could suspect of anything. But murder is something much more significant than breaking into someone's house and stealing valuable items. Detectives spoke with the boys soon after they, as later revealed, killed Andrea. At that time, they were not suspected of anything. They were just witnesses. But one can't help but wonder, if you're 13 or 14 years old and you've just committed murder, how composed will you be when the police come questioning you? The detective who interacted with them in 1993 recalls that they were calm and rational. However, they asked various strange questions, like what it's like to be in juvenile detention as a murderer. Additionally, when the detective went to one of the boys' homes, he saw a cassette with inappropriate films on the table. Moreover, when he asked each of the boys to clarify where they met Andrea and which road they took afterward, their statements differed. Nevertheless, the oddities in the boys' behavior and the discrepancies in their statements were not sufficient to accuse them of anything. Certainly, there are many cases where investigators did not hesitate to pressure teenagers and interrogate them for hours on end in pursuit of a confession, but not in this case. Perhaps the police didn't want to interrogate and pressure David and Robin for long, considering their age. Although the police officially closed the case, Andrea's parents are not convinced. They suspect that a third person was involved in the murder. Freddie, the girl's father, couldn't believe that two young boys committed such a heinous crime without the help, guidance, or at least the influence of an adult or someone older than them. Rosemary and Freddie are convinced that they had assistance. Andrea's mother's intuition has proven right before. What if her intuition isn't wrong this time? It was a completely senseless and cruel murder, and even before the killer's death, they did not alleviate the suffering of the victim's parents. Shortly before Andrea's death, she wrote an essay titled The Tale of Happiness. Andrea narrated an encounter with an old man who told her, "I worry about you because you seem so sad." He promised to grant her 3 wishes. The first was a journey at 16, and the second was a happy future. Andrea, being prudent, didn't want to waste the third wish, explaining, "Who knows what will come after, as I am already happy." However pitiful an existence the killers might lead, even if they remembered the crime they committed every day, they could move on. But for Andrea, who loved life so much, hers was taken away.